Hey, Stacy.
Hello. It wasn't letting me unmute, and now it's not. Okay. So I was playing with Kayla's filters yesterday, which is hysterical. I don't know how it's going to show up, but I don't know. Let's see. So all right, let's let Barry in. Okay. Mute, stop
Hey,
video,
Barry.
and edit.
Hello.
All right, let me.
JC has a new avatar image.
I do. I do not have this lipstick on.
Yes, you do.
I was telling Sam I was playing with Kayla's filter yesterday. So actually, I don't know how to get this lipstick off, but but it's even funnier. I mean, I thought I turned off the whole thing.
I don't know. Go to the
Wait, I want to.
video settings, and it's a subset of video settings have gotten really complex.
Well, the thing is, I had tried this snap camera thing, which I can't get you to see the picture, but I look great. But it goes in and out. So first you see me like I am right out of bed, and then you see like this all made up person, which is but anyway, let me just.
It's a third-party overlay on top of Zoom's basic set of features.
Yes, but this lipstick I must have done when I was playing around with something before I got to.
That would be the snap cam thing, I think. Maybe when Kayla comes on, she'll walk you through the fix.
Let's see, video, webcam, mirror my video. I really want this lipstick off. It looked okay with the whole thing, but it's not my morning look.
It is brighter than the average, Stacy.
It's not me at all. It is not me.
It's also made your face much whiter.
Yeah, and I'm very pale to begin with. See,
I've got commotion upstairs. Let me go see what that is. I think the dogs got loose.
Oh, I heard that noise. Video processing. I have no idea. Isn't there like an undo kind of thing?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's some kind of a toggle or a checkbox, but the question is where is it in the settings? Because I mean, if you go to your video settings,
maybe let's clear
if you have a third-party set installed, I probably wouldn't see anything like that. But see, video, let's see what the choices are. My video, touch up my appearance. So the simple version I have under my video is touch up my appearance. It may be that. And it may be more elaborate since you've got this third-party thing in there. And then there's advanced at the bottom. But for me, advanced isn't really anything relevant.
And let's try this video settings.
Yeah, either under touch up my appearance or advanced, I think you might find the feature that you got.
Yeah, it doesn't do anything. When I move the toggle from touch up my appearance, it does nothing. And adjust for low light.
Way down at the bottom where it says advanced in blue link.
Yeah.
Does that open up a whole slew of oddball new stuff?
Yes.
That's it. Because for me, it only opens up practically nothing.
But it still doesn't have video capturing method. Maybe direct show. Changes will take effect after I would have to restart. You know, I'm going to go off and restart and see what happens.
Yeah, that'll probably clear it. Did the dog survive?
It turned out to be the cats. The cats knocked over the gate near the stairs.
Oh, cats will do that. They knock things over.
That's the first time they've done that.
Can they jump over that gate, or is it too tall for them?
They can. In fact, both of them can, but normally they actually sneak underneath a bottom piece of the rail just off to the side. But sometimes they jump and sometimes they almost jump.
So it was a net ball.
Yeah, I think there was a almost jump this morning. So I see there's quite a bit of activity. I haven't tracked it all. There's about 30 or 40 posts in the group chat.
The Einstein, yeah, that Einstein thing has too many people. It's too long. But for me, the real problem is the size of the sub window is too small for a big conversation like that. I want to see.
That's why I keep saying Facebook is a lousy place to have textual conversations.
This
So unfortunately, it's where everybody is.
I'm talking about the LinkedIn one.
LinkedIn also. LinkedIn has very fixed sizes to these things. None of them are conducive to actual real conversation threads.
Yeah, I wanted to, well, on Messenger, at least on the desktop, you can make it the whole bloody window, the whole bloody screen, but where you can only see like one paragraph at a time, that's no good for me.
Look, these things are optimized for social engagement, but they're not optimized for real conversation. And the platforms that are optimized for real conversation aren't optimized for gathering people and grabbing them and keeping them engaged, unless you're serious about the conversation. And I think very few people are actually serious about conversations.
Maybe Reddit is where you have to go if you want to have a long duration, in-depth discussion. I don't know if that's any different, Stacy. You don't have your audio on. There you go.
Yeah, I couldn't figure out how to do it. Serves me right. It serves me right for being vain.
Okay,
Kayla, see if she's up.
I don't think she's going to be able to solve this problem because it's more technical. So when I try to use the snap camera, you see what happens. Yeah, that's what happens when I try to use that. So what you're seeing is something that I did while I was playing around with a whole bunch of different things that may or may not have anything to do with snap camera. And now it's there and I don't know how to get rid of it.
So the cosmetic feature, is that native to Zoom or is that native to SnapCam?
It might, SnapCam.
So then
But
you have
I
to go
don't
to
even know.
SnapCam. You have to go to SnapCam settings to change the cosmetic modifications.
Yes.
Because it's not native to the Zoom video settings.
But
Yeah.
the SnapCam isn't even working because the filter that I had put on that, I look totally different. This was as I was playing with it.
Why don't you go to Zoom settings, video, and see if you can choose a different video source, which is not Snap Camera.
I did.
Right.
That's what I'm on now. Right now I'm on my HP, my regular camera, but this lipstick is like embedded. That's what I'm saying. Like, I don't know why it's there.
It's you now. It's your new identity, Stacey.
It's horrible. Oh, well.
And Colin's here.
Merry Christmas, Colin.
Yeah, I just got my audio hooked up there, and Sam was the first voice I heard. So yes, Merry Christmas, people.
Well, you guys in the barn raising chat or whatever chat, unblocking chat, had 30 or 40 interactions, which I have not kept up with. So I'm assuming you guys have topics you want to bring to this. We're not calling this unblocking, are we?
No.
Okay.
No, not at all.
This is the post-Christmas GCC get-together.
Correct.
All right.
Did everybody have a good Christmas dinner last night?
Bless you. Yes.
Well, I kind of alluded yesterday to the fact that I was going to be enjoying some smoked prime rib, and it was fabulous yesterday.
Super.
A lot of leftovers.
I had a 5-pound rib roast, probably ate 2 of it. I have 3 left.
Did you buy it already smoked?
Yes, it was at a very good barbecue place nearby.
Ah, okay. So you didn't have to smoke it. That would take a long time.
I do have a smoker, and I have done it before, but I didn't get myself organized enough to do it this time. So I got it from this one place, and it turned out to be very, very good.
It takes like all day to smoke it, doesn't it?
It can take like 6 hours. Yeah. Yeah. The default recipe I have does it in 6 hours.
My host did turkey, kind of a repeat of Thanksgiving, but slightly fewer courses. Very similar.
Yeah. So I'm probably going to take some to neighbors today, either that or think about whether my daughter wants some when she gets here.
Was that a picture of snow that I just saw when I signed out and came back in? You have snow by you?
I did post a video that it is snowing here, yes.
Yes,
But
I
not
just
in
saw
Zoom,
that.
it's on Facebook.
No, but when I went off to re-sign in, my Facebook showed up and I saw it out of like the corner of my eye.
Yeah, I did post it was almost like Christmas. We missed it by a day.
Yeah, so Barry had mentioned that he wanted to discuss, when Kayla mentioned that feeling of power over, he wanted to discuss how we could come up with a way to notice when somebody is experiencing that. Am I accurate, Barry?
Yeah, yeah. As far as I know, there is no obvious default nonverbal signal to observe. And so maybe you have to devise a mutually agreed upon signal to suggest that you're in that state. And either way, I have to say, I don't know how to recognize if that's her state.
Yeah. Well, and like I said in the chat, I think it does require the person to indicate it. The only way that I think we could, be helpful is to, check in every once in a while.
Yeah.
And then when prompted, then the person might say something to indicate it. But I also want to say one more thing before Sam goes, which is one of the things that Kayla described, like being asked all those questions. I have a totally different take on that. So I wanted to point that out too. People experience things differently. So when somebody asks me a lot of questions, unless there's a tone of judgment in their voice, I actually like that. To me, that feels like they are interested in who I am. So again, it really needs to be confirmed by the person with the experience.
Yeah. Yeah, finding a topic of mutual interest that is the sweet spot on the interest disinterest axis. That there's got to be an art, tactical or diplomatic art to zeroing in on a topic of mutual interest without, having to have a huge conversation listing things I'm interested in, things I'm not interested in, as the clumsy way of doing that.
Sam, your hand's up. It's been up.
Yeah. I'm sensing though that many times, and this applies to me as well, if I'm feeling that I am in a way talked over, or someone is applying power to diminish my presence or diminish my effect or to diminish the group that I belong to, at times that can also serve to make one unwilling to indicate so. So in other words, if I'm saying something and Barry says, "Oh no, you don't understand mathematics," I'm going to be thinking a little bit about that first, and I'm not sure that signaling, "Hey, I just got overridden by Barry," would be the first thing that comes to mind. So I think there's going to be a delay factor in there. So it would take a while. There's a delta T between when a feeling is present to when I'm willing to even indicate to the group. So it may not be quite as useful as we think it is in order to stave off that phenomenon. I'm just wondering. I'm no expert in that.
Sometimes the delay is more than one day. Like, a lot of times I will think
Sometimes
about it,
decades.
sleep on it, and maybe days later I will come up with the first idea of how to process that. A lot of things you just can't process in real time. If it's the first time of an unexpected situation.
There is an exception to that, though. That is, if one, and I'm sorry to put it this way, is a member of a privileged class, which feels that they can speak up at any time if they feel wronged. I think the common term for this is Karens, but that's, misogynistic in some way.
Actually,
They're Kevins as well.
I hadn't heard it defined that way, but okay.
So I'm just saying that, it's much easier for certain people to say, hey, I've been wronged, or I've, been powered over, versus other groups, which are normally not quite so expressive when they feel this over.
Yeah, Stacy will remember that the one that I hesitated over is whether or not and how I should correct a misconception. That one is sort of very tricky because it can be very ego dependent on the other person. Some people want to be corrected, some people take offense at being corrected. And then the question is, what's better, to let a misconception proceed or to arrest it before it becomes embedded?
I mean, for me, the usual way, that I think is safest, I usually do the correction privately.
Yeah,
And
that's a
then,
good method. Yeah. Although you can't always do that if the person is not on your Facebook friends list or some other private channel. You may not have a private channel, especially if it's a public figure.
oh yeah, well, and again, I mean, there's no perfect formula because every situation's slightly different.
Yeah. I remember when I was in grammar school, and once in a while the teacher would say something incorrectly, not realizing it. And when I was a grammar school child, I could raise my hand and express confusion or misunderstanding and ask, something about it. And the teacher would then realize they'd said it wrong. And I could do it without embarrassing the teacher. But I could only do that when I was a child. Once I become an adult, I can't pull off that trick, that face-saving trick.
Yeah, well, you see, but that's something that women could do, but it's kind of like, I mean, I could do that too, but it got to a point where I don't want to do that. I don't want to have, somebody once said to me, you try to appear like you're not smart. And I said, no, I don't, I mean, but I guess in some ways I do, especially if I'm correcting an older white man that I'm not close to. If it's somebody I'm close to, there's a trust built in. But if it's somebody that I'm not, especially when I've noticed that they have certain bullying tactics, and Sam, that's not anybody in this group.
Hey, don't take that personally.
Don't take that personally. But as I've said before, that's why I purposely try to put myself around people that are really open to noticing things and not necessarily going to react in a defensive way, but more in a curiosity way.
Of course, in a classroom setting, when you've got 20 peer students who are being misinformed, you really don't want all your students to get the wrong information if it's new to them. I had the advantage that my older brother was a year older than me, and I tended to learn everything he was learning. So I was sort of already familiar with everything 1 year ahead of me.
I mean, there's another important difference. Are we correcting something that's factual so that there's no doubt that a correction is needed? Or are we coming from a place where it's somebody's opinion and we're trying to correct their opinion? There's a big difference.
Oh yeah, that's definitely a big difference. But usually teachers were not giving opinions, they were giving course content. So.
Yeah, no, I think, and you know what, if you're in a position of power, you already have the power. Like you should be able to, I would hope that someone in a position of power is going to welcome that kind of support of being corrected when they're wrong.
Absolutely, because if you let them make mistakes that go uncorrected, gradually their credibility degrades, and they won't realize their credibility is degrading. Sometimes I had the opposite problem, that sometimes I had such a high level of being considered credible that if I said something wrong, people would assume it was correct.
Yes.
And so it was harder for me to recognize if I had a misconception of my own, or simply said something wrong and didn't realize I had misspoken it.
And, you know, just speaking from the person doing the correcting, it's hard for somebody that is not considered an expert to correct someone else.
Yeah, yeah. But you can say something like, I missed that. Did you say X or did you say not X? Because I find that, you know, inverting the presence of or absence of the word not, I sometimes get, you know, just by mistake put the wrong invert.
But you also phrased it as a question.
Yeah.
And I think that also takes away a lot of the charge.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have to pretend that you misheard it or didn't quite catch what they said, which is not so hard for me because people do talk faster than I can listen.
Yeah, but I'm not pretending anymore.
I guess Kayla maybe not be coming today.
Well, she probably just saw the post that there's no one blocking and she didn't see the message that we're in barn raising.
Should we go into her own private
Sam
chat?
just
How about that?
posted. Did Sam, you just posted, right? I saw some
Yes.
notification fly
I
by.
posted a comment on Doug's
Oh, okay.
unblocking, blocking message.
What do I want to say? I may have to leave at some point just for a few minutes to walk the dog because he's still sleeping. He didn't want to go for a walk and I was too lazy to push him. So
Did you get freezing rain yesterday where you live?
a little bit. We had a little bit of, I saw some like snow on my window, but not really.
It didn't rain hard yesterday, but it was right at the freezing point and it was a bit treacherous.
It's still coming here, so it's at the moment it's no freezing rain, but it will become icy later.
It was interesting this morning. There's a lot of barren trees outside with the leaves gone, and there was just little droplets of water on the bare branches. And I looked out the window, and and the sun was coming in at a low angle, and so every one of these little droplets was glistening like a Christmas tree lights. And I looked at it, I go, who put lights on the tree? I said, oh, that's not lights. Those are water droplets that are catching sunlight and twinkling.
This business about correcting people doesn't have to be about correcting people, right? It's about clarifying understanding.
Yes.
And so there doesn't need to be anything nearly as pokey as I'm going to correct you. It's did you mean this? Or I thought I heard this. Is this what you said? Those kind of questioning allows people to lean in without feeling like they're being attacked.
Yeah.
And that's a skill too. I don't always do that. I sometimes, know how to do that and still choose to be pokey. So that's part of me being an asshole, I think. But,
because I work in the fix-it shop, misdiagnosis is a big issue because if some product is broken, not working, and you diagnose it incorrectly, then you can't fix it because that's not what's wrong with it. And So the issue of misdiagnosis is really a recurring problem. And of course, when those of us are trying to diagnose it, we know damn well that your first diagnostic estimate is probably not the correct one. And so you're used to looking at multiple diagnoses before you land on the one that's correct. But the average person, they'll assume that something is to blame, quote unquote, and that's it. They're done. And that's the ground truth. And try to overthrow that with the layperson. It's really not so easy.
That also happens where sometimes people take the first answer and assume that something is because of something.
Exactly.
And they stop right there.
Exactly. They don't test it and say, how do I know that that's the real cause and effect linkage? And as a scientist or science educator, I'd say, well, then how can we test that hypothesis? And so bring up a hypothesis as opposed to an authoritative diagnosis. And I don't think we use hypothesis enough in our common language to overthrow the notion that a belief is automatically accurate for your first impression.
Well, it seems like it requires at least a form of systems thinking, at least it's model-based thinking.
Exactly.
You have a model that you can poke at and say, okay, if it's this, then this must produce that. But if it doesn't produce that, maybe you should question this. That kind of model-based reasoning is important to diagnostics and not often practiced.
It's very uncommon in the lay public. That kind of systems thinking is just not only is it so uncommon. I mentioned this before. When I retired and set up my retirement account with Fidelity, the guy who did the intake to set up my records, one of the things he says, "What's your profession?" I said, "I was a system scientist." He says, "A what?" I said, "System science." He says, "What's that?" He says, "I've been doing intake for 40 years. I've never heard this profession before." And that really astonished me that there are so few people who would call themselves a systems thinker or systems scientist, that a guy who does intake on retired professions never heard of it. And Fidelity is, I think, the America's biggest retirement funding company.
Was it just a conversation, or was it a pick list on a form? Because I suspect it was long enough ago that it wasn't the pick list on a form.
It was a fill in the blank,
right?
Occupation. And like when I do my taxes, I put in, system scientist as my occupation. And I'm guessing that on a checklist, you would never find that listed as an option. It would be under other.
But I do find that even 30, 40 years ago at TRW, I was in a group doing something called systems engineering, which is not system science, but it's related.
Yeah.
And that's very important, by the way. I find that most businesses don't today think about that and don't think in terms of systems engineering. They think about building little components, but not about entire systems and what happens to systemic phenomena.
There's a funny joke at Bell Labs. One of my colleagues there, when he was from MIT, and when he went down for his employment interview, he makes this into a joke. He says, the interviewer says, and he was interviewing the systems engineering division, and so the person says, what do you estimate that this manhole cover will be worth in 25 years? And Stu says, I estimate that manhole cover will be worth somewhere between 25 cents and $1 million. And the guy says, you're our man.
Another similar interview I've heard is, how many trees are there in the world?
Twice as many as people.
People who ask those kind of questions want to understand how you think.
Yeah.
What goes into your model.
Yeah, that's a
what
Fermi.
varies in your model.
You've heard of Fermi problems, haven't you? Where you do just back of the envelope estimates without having a very precise model to work from. Fermi problems, Fermi estimates, named after Enrico Fermi, who was a famous physicist who worked on atomic energy.
So I think we've been circling around things around truth, around interaction, around trustworthiness, around thinking, around models, around evidence, around reputation. I've heard all of that today in the last few barn raising sessions,
And credibility, I'd add credibility to that long list.
which was part of reputation for me. Yeah.
Right.
Tease.
Yeah, I found the name of the, say, the model maker that made our government decide for the lockdown. So, and I shared it with Barry Cort, and then he came with the system, more some ideas. SIR, but I didn't take time to read it actually.
Yeah.
So he knows what it is, Barry.
There's a YouTube channel run by a chap named Grant Sanderson, and he does YouTube on mathematics. His YouTube channel is called 3 Blue, 1 Brown because he's got an iris color that's a mix of blue and brown. But he did a session on the SIR model, the best I've ever seen, and he did it right after the the COVID, back in March of 2019. So, and I think I maybe had heard of the SIR model, but really didn't know anything about it. But he did like a 15-minute YouTube that was just fabulous at presenting it.
Colin, you had your hand up. Do you still want to say something?
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt on what the flow, because I guess I was going to make a comment like Sam made to try to summarize the context of the conversation we're having, and to maybe highlight the fact that I think the word conversation is the conversation, and how we respect that conversation, which I call fair conversations. So there's many different kinds of conversations. So if we're just saying general things, we're kind of not got the data to do our system analysis yet. We don't have a model, because I think the model is the kind of conversation you're expecting to have. So if you have no idea of what kind of conversation you're expecting to have, then that is going to be what you call freewheeling, playing it by ear, which is much more difficult than having agreed upon models before entering a conversation. And there's the kind where, like us, we're kind of like a collective of people who are an interest group, I guess you call us. Whereas other conversations are like, they are power over by default, either through experience levels, like Sam sometimes relates to belts in some different Chinese learnings. They have different colored belts to show that you've progressed to a certain understanding as per the masters. So, this kind of a thing. So some people come into any space and just think everyone's equal. Well, I think that's a mistake in almost every space. Define what equal means. Then you have to define what the context is. Because if it's just general, we're all humans, then okay, sure, we're all equal. We all have a right to live. We all have a right to this. But if you're in a certain context, like a kitchen or a school board meeting or office getting an interview, you're not going to assume to be, taking the upper hand on somebody who's doing the interview. You're going to be, so there's different kinds of, tradition too. Different countries, you have different traditions, and you don't even realize that you're not following some kind of an etiquette of respect. So I think modeling the conversation and knowing what conversation you're in, and then trying to lean in and be honest as much as possible about bias, so that you're not speaking, you're not trying to put power over somebody, but showing somebody, well, this is the lens I use, and this is the way I see it this way. If I used a different lens, maybe I would see it differently. Show me a better lens, or show me how your lens can fit on top of my lens, and we can both have a better view. But most people go into these things thinking, well, as Barry was saying, people who don't like to tinker with things, they want the easy answer. They want the black and white situation. They want the instant equality. So, so some people aren't geared to have conversations. They're just going to come in and say, what are you guys arguing about? This is all simple. You just listen to me. People like that are dangerous, if you ask me. So anyway, yeah, so know what conversation you're in, the context, and then having the intention to have, a convivial, fair, bias, transparent conversation. Unless you're in business. If you're in business, then that's the opposite thing you want to do, right? You don't want anybody to know anything. You want to make sure they're buying your thing at the most profit you can get. Some people anyway, you know what I'm saying? Spectrums, academic, political, or scientific, or sorry, academic, political, or business. Yeah, academic would be scientific. So yeah, those are three different worlds. I didn't even bring up religion till just now. So a whole nother layer of ball of wax. So anyway.
Sam?
So I've brought this up before. One of my very, very simple lists in a blog entry that I've shared is at least dozens, if not hundreds, of different interpersonal interaction types. And Colin, I think, alluded to different contexts, but I actually named, and it's easy, anybody can do this, a bunch of different types, whether it's conversation, whether it's having coffee, whether it's having dinner, whether it's having a date, whether it's having a debate, whether it's having sex, whether it's actually having a meeting, whether it's having a brainstorming session, whether it's having a HR conversation, whether it's having an interview. There's a number, and we can just extrapolate, and there's hundreds of different interaction types. And each of them, I think, represents some of this context that sets expectation. In an interview, I would be expected to, wait for someone to ask a question or for me to ask a question, look at a response, think carefully about it, probably avoid a lot of humor, probably sit with good posture. There's a number of things expected. Whereas if I was a coffee date, humor would be, definitely up there. And, introspection and, analysis of answers is probably lower on the list. And bouncing from topic to topic is much more acceptable, whereas in an interview, that's probably going to be devalued. So the reason I mentioned this is because context sets expectations, and it also comes with a set of stakeholder roles: interviewer, interviewee, date, boss, shopkeeper, customer, etc. They all have different stakeholder roles, and each of those roles has expectations about the kinds of actions and interactions you would expect out of that role. So all of that can be expected without anybody saying, this is unacceptable, doing the power over business, right? Because there's a context. If I'm interviewing you and all of a sudden you toss a piece of chewing gum at me, that's not part of my interview context that I'm familiar with. So I'd have to go and examine that and see if it was appropriate. So even without power over, just simply by having a context, and by the way, a Zoom meeting, even one like this, has definite context. So I think this notion of power over is not necessarily just about exertion of power. It's about exertion or acceptance of expectation. The next thing I'll say, much more quickly, is power over is not necessarily bad if it enables or optimizes the context that you're in, right? So if part of the context is we value focus, which is one of the things we've been talking about here in GCC. If we value focus, then someone saying, like Stacy saying, hey, Sam, you're rambling too long, or you're off topic, or whatever, that's assisting focus. And anyone could do that if we actually have this agreement that focus is valuable. And maybe memory is another one of those things. People writing things into the text chat, writing things into a separate blog. Those are all viewed as value that assist in memory and assist in focus. So even in those cases, you might want to have explicit power over, i.e. say, okay, Tees, you're the moderator today. Please keep us focused, right? Because we value focus. And we think that power over could assist in that. That's why I really want to be understanding what context we're in, we meaning I and whoever else I'm interacting with, when I'm interacting. That way I know what the expectations are, and I know what's acceptable, quote unquote, and I know what's out of the box, quote unquote. Over.
You know, thinking about different kinds of conversations and different contexts, what comes to my mind are classical examples that we're all familiar with. The first one that comes to mind is the classical American television sitcom, where the characters are having a dialogue, they're talking back and forth, and almost always in a sitcom, it's not what I would call a conversation, it's what I would call an adversation, because they're taking conflicting points of view and they're having more of an argument, more of an adversation. Whereas if you say, consider a podcast where you have a host and a guest, it's much more of a collegial and congenial conversation where they're trying to generate a common understanding to share with the audience. So I think it's important to realize when you're in an adversation and when you're in a conversation, and which one is the one that you prefer. And it's clear to me that some people prefer adversation. I mean, if you think Saturday Night Live sketches, you know, like Point Counterpoint with Jane Curtin and Dan Aykroyd, you know, that's clearly comedy, but it's also it's a send up of an adversation. So being a scientist and educator, I love collegial and congenial conversation. But a lot of the stuff that you find on the social networks is adversation, which I'm not terribly fond of.
Oh, Stacy's got a question. Go ahead, Stacy. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that, you know, all of this is important, but for me, given the state of the world, I'm way more focused on making sure that people find their own power to question than I am about limiting. Well, no, I am concerned about limiting someone's power when it's too much. To me, that's a greater concern than maybe somebody with less power, you know, falling outside the margins once in a while. I mean, they're both important, but I think that, again, I think that children should be able to say, I don't want to kiss Uncle so-and-so. Or, you know, I mean, I think that starts at an early age. And, you know, when I look at politicians out there, it's always clear to me that it starts in our small circles. And that's what enables those kind of power dynamics where, you know, somebody that has a lot of money automatically has a lot of power. I think we need to work on those things. And I think it's a cultural shift. Colin?
Yeah. Just trying to refer back to what Barry was saying. But I guess I'm just saying the same things over and over, really. For me, the lens I see is really having, like Sam is saying, some kind of a model so you can form some loosely held expectations, right? And then people who have strong models and hold on to their expectations tightly can be adversarial if challenged with, you know, tinkering with models, basically tinkering with results of models, this type of thing. Some people feel annoyance to people who try to break things that are already fixed. So what I mean by that is, depending on who you are, conservative or liberal, for example, maybe nothing or maybe a lot needs to be done. So when you're trying to enter a conversation where you're going to have a fair chance of being understood, you know, I'm thinking there's probably 4 gates that you go through you're actually able to have a fair conversation. And I'm saying 4 could be 20. I don't know. Right. But you could think of some yourselves. One is if your worldview is completely different, then you're going to expect some problems. Then you have to see if the actual topic that you're talking about at the next level down is influenced by those worldviews, because maybe the worldview isn't going to be in effect. You know, just because somebody follows a certain religion doesn't mean that they're not going to be helpful. So, you know, there's all this filtering that we do. So I think it's the filtering to get to a place where we can trust that people are being transparent enough that you can be vulnerable enough to actually exchange with them. Because, and I think most of the time we do assume that, right? But I think if we could do that well, then we could maybe keep the number of misunderstandings to a minimum, and possibilities of where more things need to be done more clear. Where are the impasses? What's next? Where could we identify something that's next, instead of just going around and around and try to define terms, which is the pits of hell, I guess you could say. You know, trying to even get a hold of a handlebar that's hooked to anything that means anything at all. You know, you start with talking with some philosophy people, they'll question your reason of reasoning, and then you're kind of in trouble, because you know what you were just saying no longer stands. You got to back up and keep backing up until you find out that we're all using axioms of some sort or another, assumptions. So, you know, from assumptions we all use to better that we would like to define within a context that we understand, that's the game. And to filter out the people who are dishonest, manipulative, you know, adversaries. So at least you don't put them on the wrong side of the chessboard when you're playing the game. Right? So anyway, and I think that's a big part of it. I could talk endlessly about how I would like to the meta of making sure the conversation is fair. I guess that's what I'm trying to talk about. And I think Sam had a list of, here's a whole bunch of different conversations that would have different presets, perhaps, that are acceptable and expected. So if you could look at these expectations, I think that's what people who run PR businesses do. They run you through what you thought was going to happen and what's going to happen and how you can manipulate it so something better happens. Right? So anyway, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I'll put my hand down. Sam?
I think a fun game in this context would be to go into an interaction with a few possibilities. If I'm going to go meet somebody, I'm wondering to myself, is this a date? Is this a coffee meet? Is this, you know, an interview? You know, is this a business reference? And sort of then play that game. You know, where is this person coming from? Do they just want to chat about stuff and joke? Or are they really trying to get me to invest in something? Or did they really dress up and, you know, think that I ought to be taking this a little bit more seriously? You know, it's a fun game, because each of these contexts could then lead you to say, well, you know, this person really wants me to look at this 6-page PowerPoint. I don't need to worry too much about this other possible context / scenario / vignette, because now I know there's a business meeting going on. So I winnow through these possibilities to really understand what's going on, because this is normal, right? You come into somebody that you just meet, maybe nothing more than just idle conversation. If you meet them for coffee, there's a few more expectations set up. Now, if you meet on a Friday night, there's even more expectations set up. It's fun to play these contact games and at least, you know, think through yourself, oneself, myself, what the possibilities are. It's even better if you then, you know, try and get some clarification on that mutually.
Have you
It's a
ever
possible game.
had a concept? Have you ever had a concept of making a simulator, Sam? Like maybe something that was global.
I'll send you $5 later, okay, Colin?
I remember I was going to say something about humor too. That was the thing I wanted to follow up with Barry, because I think humor is a window. Art, in essence, is a window into somebody's personality and their temperament, you could say. What kind of humor do they like, right? What do they find funny? I think that says a lot about somebody. I think Sam has commented on his take on humor a few times and how he doesn't find certain things funny, especially. Yeah, so yeah, I think the realization that there's a lot of different people, there are some tools that we can use. And I think as well, like, I think when I'm saying I think, I'm making a mistake from listening to Marshall McLuhan. No, not Marshall McLuhan, sorry. Marshall, the nonviolent guy. Marshall
Rosenberg.
Rosenbaum.
Rosenberg.
Marshall Rosenberg, yeah.
Yeah. But, I think that we have to appreciate the fact that people are different and coexist. So that seems to be, as much as you want everybody to believe what you believe and enjoy what you enjoy, you think about it, the variety is nice too. So the question is, what stuff is outside of the scope of acceptability of what you consider better? So what is unacceptable? What is danger? I think that's all you really have to be alerted to. The rest we can improv. Like, I love the idea what Sam was saying about, it's almost like you open up an envelope. They give you 3 clues what to do and where to go. And as soon as you go in the door, there's a door you have to go in. You don't know what's on the other side of the door. And you get like 3 seconds to prepare. You open up an envelope and says you're about to apply for a job. And then 1, 2, 3, in you go. You know what I mean? Just so that you know what's beyond the door before you open it, but you don't know before you get there. So the time difference is irrelevant, really. That would be interesting. And then to have the psychologist, how can you prepare for almost anything, right? With just so few clues. So I think part of the enemy is the unknown, or what was the word I was thinking of earlier? There's a better word for what you don't expect, essentially, for what you're not expecting. So the model gives us expectations. I think the more conservative, I don't know if this is the right word, conservative minded you are, the more you want the quick answer. The more liberal minded you are, the more you're willing to tinker to find a more optimal answer. I've had conversations with people that just have no patience to consider the data, to reconsider what's going on. And I think the analogy is where, people act first and ask questions second. They're used to fixing everything for a hammer, and they say, why are you guys taking so long? Grab the hammer, go and hit it and break it. And then they say, oh, I see why you guys were waiting so long. That's so annoying. And I think the world is a bunch of those experiments, just more complicated, people taking hammers and hitting things. And sometimes just because they want more money, they don't care if there's pollution, right? Or they just want the employee to do something. They don't care if they hurt the employee's feelings. They just need the profits. Like, look, you're fired if you don't do what I'm saying here. Like, I don't need you to be my friend. I need you to do the job. I'm sorry. I'm gonna have to let you go. That kind of thing. So yeah, it's context sensitive. Humor, I think, is a lens into somebody's temperament. Oh, and I think Sam just had a buzzer, so it's his turn. No. Okay, so humor is a lens into someone's temperament. And the other thing I was talking about is context is so important, that the idea of playing Sam's game, where the unknown is the element and expectations is the emergence, is quite interesting to see what expectations can emerge on the spot and change the way that you experience. I think that that game idea is interesting, Sam. It needs some more development, but I can see the possibilities of somebody having to, really be on their toes to get through the gauntlet.
Yeah, and the fun part is culture obviously plays a big part of this. I'll tell you that, we never went to restaurants when I was a kid. And even after I started, even getting familiar with what happens in a restaurant, like, do I get drinks first? Do I order my appetizer and the main dish at the same time? Even those things are very hard for me to learn initially. And one of the hardest was, and this happened 2 weeks ago, what happens if the food is actually not very good? I'm not brought up to complain about food. And so that was very, very difficult to learn. Here, and this is a place that has really fabulous crab rolls. Best crab rolls I've ever had in my entire life. Every time I go there, I get a crab roll, sometimes two. And if you know anything about lobster rolls and crab rolls, those aren't the most affordable items on the menu. The last time I went, it was inedible. There's hardly any crab in there, way too much mayo. And I just sat there for a whole hour after having only taken half a bite.
There's a documentary right there.
So cultural influences play into what even a certain context finds acceptable. Also, I was brought up with very different notions about tipping and what tipping was supposed to mean. When I first learned about tipping, 5 to 15% was a range. Now you go places, automatically 18% is already added to the bill at certain places. And 15%, makes you look cheap these days. I find it very, very curious what expectations come with culture. So even in the same general context of a dinner at a restaurant, there's many, many different influences. Imagine somebody from a different continent coming to the same restaurant. There's going to be very different expectations there. Or from an entire country that doesn't exercise tipping at all. That's a very American thing, I think. Anyway, so culture sets a lot of expectations, which for most go unspoken until there's a disappointment. Over.
So like in the case of the restaurant that you brought up, that's where the server's supposed to come in and say, is everything okay? And that's what I meant by the prompt. And then it's up to the person with the experience to come forward with that information.
Yeah. By the way, that did happen because this particular server knows me very well because, he's always amused by how I always order the crab roll. And by the way, he likes the way I play violin. This is the same place I play for the farmer's market. So he was the very first to say, you always eat that crab roll in like 3 minutes every time you're here. You've sat here for an hour and you've only taken one bite. Tell me what's the problem. And it was still kind of awkward to even say, hey, do you have the same chef today? Are you sure you had enough crab back in the kitchen and all these sort of things? Rather than
how long did it take him?
Oh, he did it in the first 5-10 minutes, as his
good.
skill.
Good.
But me, all I'm saying is I beat around the bush a little bit, trying to be polite and, trying to say, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. I wasn't very direct. This is why I'm, I guess, showing that I'm raised in a different place. I didn't just come out and say, this crab roll is just not good today. I never said that.
If I could just
Yeah, sure.
add, if I could just, just give a little bit more perspective to that. You're saying that could alert the kitchen to a big problem. I was recently at a restaurant and the people that ordered steaks, the steak was horrible, but I was mortified when they kept complaining because the way it was done, it felt like it was just about getting the money off the bill. But in the end, the kitchen, the owner came out, she was so grateful because the steak really was tough and she didn't want to serve it. I mean, they took it off the menu for the night because there was something wrong with it. So, you know, in a way you do a disservice when you don't answer honestly.
I think Sam was doing both too, because I think earlier you made the point about saving face. So Sam's reluctance to be belligerent would allow them the chance to save face and still capture the problem, right? Patience. But crab stuff, you know, that could be dangerous too, because, you know, food poisoning and stuff. So, you know.
Yep. Kayla knows what I'm talking about because I took Kayla there, and I think on that night I had 2 crab rolls that night.
So I missed out. Did you have food poisoning?
I said
Or just
about a week and a half
the
later, I
crab
went back
was
there with a different friend, Kayla, and the crab
Uh-huh.
roll was inedible. It was horrible.
Ooh.
Oh, it was so bad. I couldn't believe it was even the same place.
And you didn't tell them?
Well, I was kind of trying to be polite about it. I said, is the chef the same chef? Are you running out of crab? Did you have to like put in extra mayo and only 2 pieces of crab because you're running out of crab, you know? So they got the message. I didn't have to be belligerent as Colin describes, but I think they got the message. And they did take, I think, $10 off the bill, which that was, I think it's only about
Help.
40% the price of a crab roll.
Well, hello everybody. I jumped on because Tees said that the topic earlier, before I went to the bathroom, was about power over. So I'm wondering if this crab roll incident was in contribution to discussing the topic. So
A little bit.
Yes, it is connected. And I'm gonna give a hopefully 30-second summary, which is, I was kind of describing that context set expectations. So context being either it's a coffee meet, a date, a Friday night, you know, fancy outing, or an interview, or a brainstorming session, or whatever, you know, there's hundreds of different types of interactions. Context sets expectations, and those expectations could determine whether something is appropriate or inappropriate, even without power dynamics. But then power dynamics on the flip side, depending on the context, could still be useful. Like for example, if T says, hey, you're off topic, or Sam, you've been talking too long, then that might help me refocus and the entire group refocus if focus was valuable to the group. So there's ways in which power can be exercised, i.e. in moderation, which is
Right.
not degrading to the person that's being subjected to it. But I do think that this is all beating around the bush, because you did say there are cases definitely where power expressed and power over is inappropriate. And I think that was what prompted people to say, hey, you know, Kayla, Stacy, you know, we touched on this topic in the last couple of sessions, so that might be useful. So anyway, Tees has his hand up to further elaborate.
Yes, and Barry said, if you make it into a hypothesis, then you ask about the hypothesis. So with cause and effect. So if you disagree, then is this your hypothesis? Or do I understand you're correct? Then it's not a person, but it's the understanding that is the cause of the discussion. So that's, some can elaborate on that again. So the understanding and not the power over.
And then the very last thing I was talking about was cultural effects on expectations. And that's where the restaurant story came in, Kayla.
oh, that's awesome. That's why I love you guys. Sounds like a wonderful discussion. Thanks for
And
inviting
it
me,
was-
Keith.
It was wrapped in a reality game of being presented a card and going into a room not knowing what to expect. And you could like, so what are your expectations? So it could be a job interview or whatever. We're thinking of a game. I think Sam was trying to lay out, and I was thinking about that too. What kind of gauntlet you would have to run through to show the difference between what you might have done if you had time to prepare, I guess, is one of the things we're removing here. But there could be other elements to it as well. It could be very interesting to see what kind of a expectation juxtaposition you could make.
that context, by the way, if I may, was Kayla, in the case where, let's say I decide to meet somebody for a coffee. So now I've got a few possibilities in my head. I know you know this, right? Is it just a coffee date, okay? Or is this just a kind of a filter session to see if we want to do something on Friday night? Or is this person actually going to hand me a 6-page PowerPoint and see if I have, some money to put into their business? Or is it that they want a referral to another friend of mine at Google because they want a job, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So is a coffee date just a coffee date? Or are there other sort of contexts, that might be more at play there? And that's the game that I suggested that we could all be playing in our minds is, what happens if you meet somebody at the supermarket and say, hey, let's meet for coffee. Boom, all of a sudden, at least 4 or 5, possibly more possibilities, vignettes, scenarios, contexts could be at play. And I know you know this, but that was part of why I was suggesting that game. Over.
Wow, that's great. That you mentioned cultural. So I'll give you an example of something that was really interesting that happened. I was inviting one of the leaders of my dance group back in the day, to go out, forgot where, to a party or to do something. And he was like, well, I'll think about it. I've known him for so long that I was like, you could just say no, you're not gonna go because I'll think about it. Or maybe denoted, yeah, I'm not gonna go. And so I finally was kind of tired of him not being so straightforward. I said, you don't have to go. You could just say, oh, I'll pass. And I was encouraging him to do so because, again, I was just kind of tired of the maybes because the maybe gave just a glimmer of hope. But then I interpreted it later as that was just his cultural practice. Everybody in his family was just like that, where they, had the inability to say no because they didn't want to appear impolite. And it kind of bugged me as an Asian American because, no is perfectly fine. Now, the funny thing that you bring about a coffee date is this one gentleman that I actually did go on a date on. He had invited me over to his house where he'd cook. And I won't tell you the whole story, but I just kind of sat there. He wrote a text. He said, we'll go over to my house at 6 o'clock. Before then, we'll go over to the beach and watch the sun go down. And, I'd talked to this gentleman, but I'd never really gone out with him. And that just to me was like, whoa, I hope he doesn't have any expectations because walking on the beach and going to his house for a nice dinner sounds kind of romantic to me and at a level where I wasn't very comfortable with. So I very politely put on the text, I hope you don't take this wrong, but I just want to let you know that I'm a prude, and if you're expecting anything in the sexual content, it's just not going to happen. And I said, so I would feel more comfortable if we went out to sushi, and I would completely understand it if you don't want to go out with me at all, because that's kind of not what I want, and I have no idea what you want. And for the first time in I don't know how many years, he just kind of wrote LOL. Aw, I get it. And he said, if you want, we could go to happy hour. Oh, made me so happy. But there are ways in which a person can, in context, be straightforward, beat around the bush, as you say. And the other person, hopefully, on the receiving end, would interpret it as such, as not really a power over. Is that what you guys are kind of talking about? Ways in which you could appear not to have so much power over?
Yeah, I think that was one of the points that has been raised, I guess, by Stacy.
Got it.
But I was
Okay.
thinking, sorry, may I talk?
Yeah.
Yeah,
for
because I thought, well, for yesterday, you said you were powered over more or less by someone talking and talking, not listening, not asking questions and so on. So we didn't discuss that subject so far yet. So your context of being powered over was not yet in discussion.
Yeah, I had actually raised that in the messenger thread before we started the session, and I actually copied and pasted it into the chat. I'll read it. This is when Stacy says, what could we possibly talk about today? And I said, one topic I'd like to get clarity on is reading hard to read nonverbal signals. For example, if Kayla is experiencing power over, what visible or audible signals would signify that for the benefit of those who are otherwise oblivious of that state of being?
Yeah, I
I
think
think that's
about,
that's the context Sam brought up with waiting and not being belligerent when his food wasn't as expected. And yeah, he waited a while and contemplated what to do. So, and that plays into Stacy wanting people to be able to save face, right? And that's kind of what you were doing with your date, just being direct was what Kayla was saying. Just be direct. If you do know, be direct, right, Barry? Instead of beating around the bush. Like, what signal can you give me? How about the fact that I'm not a prude, or I am a prude?
Well, yeah, I was dealing with the absence of any recognizable signal.
Yeah.
Well,
there can be zero, or there could be, ambiguity in the signal, right?
But that's raises the point. How do you signal a feeling in a way that's unambiguous yet socially acceptable? And if there's an absence of a signal, can you, like Stacey says, well, we're not mind readers. So what would be a good way to signal that that's unmistakable? I think Sam has his hand up.
well, I noticed that Teese asked the question of Kayla, and I don't think Kayla's yet had an opportunity to respond.
Can you ask the question again for clarity? Sorry.
Teese, would
You raised on Saturday, Kayla, about being powered over. So, well, of course, it's a context of dating. But anyhow, being in a situation that other people show power, well, then don't feel happy. And then you said, okay, I like to put questions and have an open mind. And then, so the situation of experiencing this power over, then body card comes, how did you come to experience that power over? Is the clues in the talking, is the clue in the nonverbal reactions of the person? So how do you experience that power over? So how do you discern it?
How do you signal it?
So are you asking me of specific examples, or are you asking me what I do to?
It's general.
Or
so
both.
just ask. Okay, just answer what you want to ask.
Okay. I know in a group setting, sometimes when we, go into conversation, and this isn't just within this group, it's other groups as well, where we're sitting in a circle and discussing life things. And oftentimes it's one or two or even three people who talk the most. And others, you can tell, and how I usually tell is I like to, especially when we're in a circle, just look at a person's body language. Oftentimes, when you really look at a person's body language, you can see that they have something to contribute. And I know Stacy is pretty good with this, especially in this group. She will say, Sam, I feel like you have something to say, or Barry, you look like you're about to say something. And that's one way I feel like we can discern that, is to really take a look at somebody's body language and give them an opportunity to speak. Now, when two or three people are having this discussion, I've noticed that oftentimes they will say what I've wanted to think. So I've learned in the background how to just kind of let say what they want to say. But sometimes it's frustrating because if you have the same 2 or 3 people talking and talking and talking and not giving anybody a chance to, you know, that to me is exercising kind of power over within a group dynamic instead of sitting back and seeing what else somebody has to contribute. I personally have always been like this. I know yesterday we were discussing popularity. Again, as one of the, we had, you know, little cliques in our dance group. And I was one of the frontline cliques. And it was cool. Don't get me wrong. I liked it. I liked being the frontline clique that everybody like looked up to. But what I didn't like is when my friends took advantage of that and just kind of preened, and yes, they know they're the front line and they look great and they're beautiful and they get all the attention, and that's just how it should be. I was the one person in our group to be like, no, let's go over to the back line and see how they're doing. And it was always so appreciated that the girls in the back would say, we're the, you know, we can only come to you because we're so intimidated by the girls in the front line. And it was amazing because our group leader also had that ability to discern that the girls in the back line, some of them have great talent. And it's just so nice to be able to see somebody come into this position where they can contribute what they need to contribute, you know. And we often had girls in the back line or the third line come to the front. And it was funny because my friends would be like, oh, why is she here? She's not initiated into this cool club, you know? Whereas in my opinion, it was like, oh, good for you. You have the talent, you've got the drive. Our leaders had the discernment to see that that person is so willing, you know, and talented, and they gave them an opportunity. And that's all that I ask. And that's what I like, is when there is an opportunity for someone who doesn't have too many words to actually speak up. It's beautiful. And what they say often is in context with the group, and it's a great contribution. And it's just their softness and their ability to glow is just a beautiful thing. So hopefully that answers your question. Sorry.
And I think that's watered with kindness and respect as opposed to too much of the stick, right? But I don't know. If somebody has a possible diamond in the rough, it's best to not be too critical. Like, I think that if that's what you mean, Kayla, and also include them. You're saying like it was a click in this case. Yeah. So if they wouldn't have got noticed by you or somebody else, they never would have reached the upper level. Is that what you're saying? Because that's where the attention's being. There's special schools within universities too. You can go to, but you also got to be taught in the right place in Princeton where Albert Einstein was taught, you know, and then you're in the in group. I heard that story from somebody recently. So there is the upper echelons of things. And I think that filtering just happens naturally. You know, I know kids can be cruel, but I think talent should shine through. I know in the world of music, it's not the people who play the best that make it to the top all the time. There's a lot of luck involved, sacrifice. So yeah, I think you've talked about a lot of sacrifice with your dancing too. So yeah, interesting. Interesting.
Go ahead, Sam.
I have a question for Stacy, because I think I remember from yesterday's conversation that Stacy noticed that there were 2 intelligent women who were kind of not speaking as much as the men were. So I was wondering if Stacy had more to add, or whether Kayla had captured what you were identifying yesterday.
Again, I was out walking the dog, but I think mostly from what I heard, I suspect things were all captured. Is there something in particular?
Well, in that, what I heard Kayla just now speak, she talked about a dance experience. But I was wondering whether there was an experience yesterday in the barn raising that was more pertinent, that caused you to then, bring up that issue for both you and Kayla.
The reason I brought up my issue in barn raising was a little bit different. I'm very interested in taking small pieces of conversation first, making sure everybody understands what's being said before they decide if they agree or disagree. Taking a breath, slowing it down, and then moving on to the next step. So that's what my comment yesterday was about. Because when that doesn't happen, then you might get people tuning out for different reasons, and you might lose some valuable contributions that they could have made.
That's great. I'd like to use that for the byline of the game of discernment, if I could, please.
My pleasure. I'll be back. I just got to go feed him because as I put in the chat, I feel very guilty for making a really short walk because it is sunny and beautiful out. So let me make up for it with some chicken. I'll be right back.
This is, Stacy mentioned tuning out, and that's sort of the opposite of what Kayla observed about Stacy. Kayla said Stacy can readily detect if Sam or Barry is eager to jump in. But if somebody's tuning out, I think, at least for me, it's harder to say, oh, I can see that person's tuning out. It's much easier to see somebody sort of, getting ready to proceed as opposed to somebody who's just sort of sitting there. Okay. Is there a better way to recognize that somebody is tuning out than just to say, oh, I've noticed over a period of a minute that they're just sitting there? There's got to be a more reliable signal that you're feeling powered over than just, going into a 1,000-yard stare.
I think the routine of having check-ins, like in between, like, somebody designated to actually be looking for those signs. I mean, that's something I've always been an observer. So I'm usually more tuned into that, but that's because I like doing that. I think that it should actually be a role of somebody just, paying attention to the energy of a group and then having it be part of the practice to just give a minute if anybody has to check in or actually even going specifically and asking the question, because it's a lot easier for people to say difficult things once they've been asked the question directly.
So moderator polling or attending.
Doug's actually really good at that.
Looking for the absence of a signal. Sorry, Kayla, go ahead.
I was saying that Doug's actually really good with that. And it is hard, especially in the Zoom setting. I mean, I personally, you caught me doing dishes, but it's the holidays, so I can put the dishes down and engage in the conversation. So it's kind of hard, especially when you can turn off your camera. It's easy when you have children. You could just see the completely turning off. Have you ever seen children just like zone out and you're all right, you're not listening to me. So go ahead and move on with your life right now.
Yeah, eyes glaze over, but it's hard to see eyes glaze over in a gallery mode on Zoom. You can barely tell they even have eyes. They're so small.
Just one last thing, Sam, can I say? Is that okay? Just kind of going to what you're saying, Stacy, which I think Doug is actually pretty good at, is taking a moment and just asking. And it takes, a lot of practice to be able to sit there and recognize somebody hasn't spoken and just check in with them. Okay, I'm done.
one of my wishes, I guess a fantasy, is for that not to be necessarily such a singular role of a moderator or a observer type, but that become a skill that hopefully all of us get some facility with. You know, yeah, I may never get to be more than second or third grade level on that skill. Most people might be able to attain sixth grade or ninth grade skill on that. Some people might get PhD level facility with it, but at least it's a skill I would like all or most to recognize and cultivate. That actually is one way to get away from having a single person with the authority and the power to say, you're off topic or you're talking too long, if we all can sort of be more observant and aware of that. Cool.
I think that we sort of have that in this group, and you know, and in unblocking as well. And the way that I think that was cultivated is there was a safe environment created. I mean, when I came to GCC, I don't think I spoke for a year. I mean, I sat back and Barry's eyes just like popped open, but I was trying to figure out, like the same way, Sam, you were trying to figure out how a restaurant works in terms of tipping and when to order. I was trying to find out, when do we speak? What do we speak about? What's going on? And it took at least many months, if not a full year. But it was clear to me, because it was spoken about, that the desire of the group was to become more inclusive, more egalitarian. So at least I knew those were the expectations, and it gave me the safety net to at least be willing to try and see what kind of response I got. So yes, I agree with you. I think that's the way it should be. I think we have that here to a large degree. And I think it starts with trust and building trust. I'm sorry, I got to go feed him. Here's his chicken.
Stacy really is very observant. And, you know, and I'm talking about grade levels. I consider myself in kindergarten when it comes to detecting and interpreting nonverbals.
I actually enjoy listening to you, Barry. And Sam, I do enjoy listening to you too.
Yeah, one of the metrics that I try to adhere to is say the most interesting and relevant things in the fewest number of words in the shortest amount of time.
I'm actually a Sam Han fan.
There's a Collaborology Institute. Maybe you're the person. Maybe you're the person to push Sam in the direction of this Collaborology Institute initiative re-expansion.
I think I found my marketing person.
Well, that gets
Well, I'm
back to,
nominating her because, you know, all the pieces are in place. They just need to be expanded.
that gets back to Sam's observation of what's the intention of a dialogue, a meeting. And I would think that Sam would say, is this meeting going to lead to an opportunity to collaborate?
When I say all the pieces, I don't mean all the pieces. I mean a good collection of starting pieces. That's something maybe we should do. What is the state of the Sam Ham Collaborology Institute Dream Foundation?
We're still pouring the foundation.
I just like how Sam rates people. You say it so intelligently. I can get away with it.
Yeah. It's all good.
I have to notice, you know, when I'm so into a conversation that I'm really focused on the topic, I find myself de facto noticing body posture, facial expressions much less, because I'm in this mental space, this mental model space. I'm putting ideas together. I'm trying to figure out whether this fits here, that fits there. So I'm not actually looking at facial expressions and body language, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm actually aware they don't want to get too interested, that kind of degrades. On the other hand, if I shut up and I'm not necessarily thinking, okay, so how am I able to contribute, but I'm more observant, I can actually increase my level of awareness on body posture, facial expression, if I'm actually deferring how closely I'm tracking the topic of the conversation. So there's like, that might be just a way for me to recognize that my mental capacity is limited. So either I invest it here, or invest it there, or invest it someplace else. And it's not a infinite source of cognitive capability. I guess I have to choose where to focus in my own brain/mind. Over.
Body language is actually very fascinating.
It is. Did you know there's an encyclopedia of body language?
No.
There's actually CIA videos on YouTube, people actually telling you how to read body language, and especially how to tell when somebody's lying.
Yeah. It came out, probably 15 years ago, and it was on the internet. I don't know if it still is, but it has photographic examples of body language and then an explanation of it, interpretation of it. And trying to remember James Dean. There's an actor named James Dean, and he was featured as one of the examples in this book on body language. And a photographer once was taking my picture to associate with an article, and he said he wanted me to put myself into a James Dean pose, which I didn't know what that was, but he sort of directed. And so I have actually a photograph up on my website that's, well, supposedly me in my James Dean pose, but I don't know what it means in terms of body language.
Is that like leaning on a motorcycle? Like I'm trying to figure out.
It was
In a t-shirt?
against the wall. But I think
and some jeans.
Yeah, the jeans was sort of the hip at a kind of a cockeyed angle, a casual angle, and so not too stiff, not somebody in a suit, it's sort of casual, but in command of the situation. I guess maybe that's what it was supposed to be. Somebody, probably Stacy, could interpret it and write a paragraph to explain what it's supposed to mean.
I just laugh at, well, I don't laugh, it's kind of sad, but I have too many experiences where somebody's been like this and they've been telling me that they're not closed off.
Now that I think of it, James Dean was in Rebel Without a Cause, and I think the article was about having a rebellious nature. So yeah, I guess I'm a rebel. Maybe that's what the message is supposed to be. Go ahead, Sam.
Do any of you remember a TV show called Lie to Me? Or did nobody else ever see this?
I never saw
Remember
it.
to tell the truth, but not lie to me.
I heard of it, but I never saw it.
Yeah,
You know what it's about, right?
I don't remember.
Advertising business?
No, there's this guy, a consultant that gets hired to solve very difficult cases, usually criminal cases. And the reason he's brought in is because he's studied micro expressions. Like he studied what happens when the lip, curls a little bit, or when you furrow your brow just slightly, or your ears twitch a little bit, or you cock your eye at a different angle. And he can actually tell these little, many micro indicators whether someone is actually lying. So it's kind of an interesting crime series where rather than, go to CSI, go into the lab, etc., this guy goes up and just interviews people and just asks some very pointed questions, surprising questions, to watch for micro expressions. And then he goes back and says, clearly lying, or this person's telling the truth, let's look somewhere else. So I thought that was an interesting take on the whole crime genre.
Yeah.
The show Bull does the same thing in terms of jury selection. When they're picking the jury, they're asking the questions and they're looking for the micro expressions.
Training robots to do that today. I think the first series is ready, isn't it, Sam?
Lie to
Robots
me?
to read micro. No,
He's
the
talking about
robots who can
robots.
read facial expressions.
Oh, Well, that's been a work in AI/machine learning for quite a long time already.
Yes,
Yeah.
20 years.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mana El Kaliubi is my colleague at the Media Lab who pioneered parsing images, webcam images, and then recognizing which emotional expression was on the face of the individual.
And not only that, looking across different channels, like looking at text, looking at voice indicators, looking at facial indicators. And in fact, my son at UC Santa Cruz was part of a project that was trying to do sarcasm detection. Imagine that.
So I think I mentioned
NLP or through text or through video.
Combinations of those indicators.
Yeah.
His area was text.
Yeah. But I can see how video is going to be the king, right?
Oh, definitely. But
18,
much more data
18
there.
shots, 18 snapshots is all you need.
And tone of voice. Tone of voice is very powerful.
Yeah.
Sam?
There's another practice I'm seeing emerging in chat where you guys know what the up caret signal is on the keyboard?
Replace.
Up caret, yeah. So if you actually surround your text with up caret, front and back, okay, it's kind of this new convention to indicate sarcasm. So that's one of these conventions that's coming by.
Oh,
So
no,
that's
I haven't heard this
beautiful
one
today, and I put that in upper carets, then that's supposed to indicate sarcasm. Some
Or
people
is
are
it
trying
double?
to promote that practice. Yeah.
Sorry, is that double sarcasm? Because usually you put that in quotes, right? Air quotes for sarcasm. You
No.
can.
how do you do
in
air
context.
quotes on text?
I think he means double.
Well, that's what I mean. Yeah, the double quotes. Yeah, you put well, you use two fingers, Stacy. You gotta.
Right, I know, but he's saying on
It's
text. So
a-
instead of
you
two
push
fingers,
shift. Well,
Yeah.
you could put it in single quotes if you don't want to be if you want them to be confused, or double quotes. But now this is better. We've got a new one. I mean it sarcastically, intentionally.
Right.
It used to be quick edit, caret, wrong word, caret, corrected word. That's
Yeah,
the old. that's the old meaning.
what am I trying to say? The asterisk is a good one too on each side.
That's a bold
That'll
move
do it.
Yeah.
indicator.
Yeah, but it's also the original. I think maybe it's been
Yeah,
superseded
bold or
due to-
italics. Yeah.
due to markup. Yeah, go ahead.
So I was about to indicate to Barry, I was thinking about your question. So I went to Zoom and I looked at all the different reactions and emojis that Zoom allows me to pick. None of them really jump out at me as saying, I feel powered over or I feel diminished in some way. So the way that I've done it, just to admit to you all, sometimes, and it doesn't always mean this, okay, is that sometimes when I hear something and I want to lean back and reflect a little bit, I actually turn off my video.
Yeah.
Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes I turn off my video because I go to deal with dogs, or because I have to sneeze, or because I have to go pee, or whatever, okay? But sometimes when it's something that catches me off guard and says, did they really mean that? Did they really poke at me a little bit? I would turn off my video and go into kind of a retrospective session there. So I'm just kind of saying that might be one possible way, although, like I say, it's confusing because it may have lots of other meanings.
I think one thing me and Glenn talked about, and you touched on it with speaking about your son today. And these new chat bots, they search for this stuff in real time, right? They search for different things. So there's no reason why you couldn't turn your camera off and say, I'm thinking, or turn my camera off, mildly triggered. You know what I mean? And put the little carets with maybe minus signs on each side, and that we know it's the GCC emoji, whatever the word is in between.
I tried the 1,000-yard stare, but it didn't seem to have any significance to the intended recipient.
Well, you know what? I'm like Sam a lot. I listen to people. I might not even be at the camera. I might be doing dishes, doing a lot of things, but I'm listening.
I just want to point out that there are at least two very distinct different reactions to that kind of a situation, and they need to be handled differently. So there's when an anger starts building up about the situation you find yourself in, That's going to yield one reaction. Then there's the other where you shut down, and that's coming more from like a personal insecurity that you just really can't engage, and maybe you don't belong there. And those need to be treated very differently, even though they're related.
Well, I think that's filtering, right? So there's a filtering mode to get
What does that mean,
alignment.
Colin? I have no
Well,
idea.
if you're not aligned with the conversation, you can filter yourself out, somebody else out, whether it's due to missed expectations, disruption, ignorance, whatever the case may be. You can filter.
Right,
Yeah.
but you don't want someone who has something to offer to a conversation to filter themselves out for reasons that may be dealt with differently. I mean,
Well, that's
if we're
finesse.
talking
That's
about
finesse, yeah.
collective intelligence, and if we're talking about a complete system, and we want to get as much information as possible, then I think we need to pay attention to not repeat the past as they refer to power dynamics. Like,
Well,
we
I
have
think
to try to do something differently.
Yeah, power dynamics is temperament and behavior, which Glenn speaks of a lot. Like if we could just control our behavior. But I'm also thinking that respect is shown by the effort. And I think the effort to show results has to be in memory. And the goal is achieved of focus and refocus and regression and digression and review and extrapolate. Like, I don't know, sometimes when I get talking with Doug, sometimes I'm in the wrong conversation because he's in such a different framework that my temporal words don't even fit. So, and so then we're arguing about definitions instead of expectations, or what I'm saying, when you're in different frameworks, like with Doug and Sam, I think you really have to have alignment. It's to some degree, if you're actually going to expect to have a good conversation. And I think conversation skills is in that alignment. So that's what I was mentioning, Stacy, is once you have that alignment in the filtering towards a greater good, or filtering out noise from getting to that greater good, there's always another time around. You can't have everybody cooking the same soup, right? So some are general meetings, some are specific meetings. So you do have to filter. Thank you.
Kayla?
I just wanted to go back to the cultural context of things. And I just discovered kind of a hypocrisy within myself. You know how I often talk about children being, it's not good that children are just seen and not heard. Well, going to culture, what I observed with the Polynesian culture was very interesting in the sense that there was a mutual respect among all the generations and an expectation. Like, for instance, they did say children should be seen and not heard. The children sat around while the adults were talking, or they went off to play. And it was really cool because as they sat around and observed the adults talking, they would absorb things. And when I did have an opportunity to talk to the kids, I would ask them, so what do you think of what your parents are talking about? And it was the coolest thing because, they had this like really cool conversation within themselves where they emulated the adults, but then they had their own opinions kind of peppered into it. And I thought that was really cute. And it was a really good opportunity for me to hear what young Polynesians thought about their older generation. And the even cooler part now is that younger generation has grown up, and you can now see the changes that they implement, at least in the dance world, from those initial conversations. So while I don't think it's good to power over, meaning the negative aspect of powering over, like children do not have a voice and you cannot have a voice until you grow up, it is kind of nice to have this mutual respect, for your colleagues, for older generation, younger generation. How that would play out kind of in a worldly context, I have absolutely no idea, because this is something that's challenging since everybody has different cultures, comes from different backgrounds, etc.
This is a
That's
reminder.
my cue to stop.
Take notes.
Barry, are you doing an experiment?
Not really. I was very keenly interested in hearing what Kayla had to say, and I wasn't intentionally expressing keenness, but I was in fact keenly interested in attending,
Okay.
which is not true for a lot of people talk and they don't really say anything of interest or anything at all. Sam and Kayla almost always are right on point, say something relevant, interesting, worth attending to. So does Stacy. So other people can talk and not really say anything.
It's not typical that you lean into the camera like that. So
That's true. That's true. Yeah, that's true. But also, Kayla's image is pretty small. It's postage stamps. So one reason leaning is I can actually see your face better, unless I would go to, what do you call it?
You can pin
Speaker
her.
mode. Yeah, I didn't go to speaker mode. I'd be switching too often.
Full
and-
screen Kayla. Yeah, no, I'm saving them from full screen me, that's for sure.
I mean, going to speaker mode with Colin wouldn't help.
Yeah, no. I say the same thing anyway, Barry.
Well, I've
Always.
noticed you repeat a lot.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to
So-
stay on focus because I think it's where the nail is.
The other thing I was thinking when Colin was talking, because he used the word alignment, I think 5 times in a row. And what came to mind is there are certain words that are very sophisticated, but they're also kind of general words. They don't really have a specific meaning. And it's easy to pepper your conversation with these important sounding, sophisticated words that really don't actually say anything because they're too general, or they're like a whole cloud or a whole suitcase.
Ever read the
And,
Bible?
And I remember in particular a talk at Stanford that was on the video, and the guy really overdid it. He had all of these very abstract, generic, sophisticated sounding, erudite words, but there was no real content because the words didn't mean anything specific. And he talked for like 20 minutes, and at the end of it, he say, "What did he say?" And the answer was, he didn't really say anything.
In business, that's called buzzword bingo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always
I
thought it
find
would be so,
sometimes.
I'm
Oh, go
sorry,
ahead,
real
Stacey.
quick. I just thought it'd be so cool if we got like charged by the word when we like commented on Facebook or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it would be interesting. I think one of the early visions we had was each person have a small, medium, large, I don't know, blurb. And I think Lauren one tried to record these, call them profiles. But it would be interesting to have these things. So somebody new comes into the group, they get the best of Kayla and the smiles and what she's interested in. And then when they come to the group, they immediately know where she's coming from. And, and then maybe a few highlights from things that in the videos that really mean stuff to us. We could, like Barry would be a good indicator of stuff that he understood. So, he could point things for him, and we could each do those things. I think Barry's has a reputation of being somebody who analyzes quite well. Oh,
Popcorn.
yeah.
What is that?
And so, so I don't know what projects we could pull together to discern something. But like I was saying earlier, if we had maybe a collaborology focus meeting and what pieces we could bring together, because it's a broad subject, and alignment means having the conversation that's transparent, that you feel like you have understanding, right? Like you've steel-manned positions and have micro agreements of some sort. So this has all been said before. People have screamed and fought the words. Well, I rebuke your disingenuating my alignment word, Barry, because you should be helping me foster what it actually means. But you're right to point these things out.
One of the interesting workshops I was in at Bell Labs was a communication workshop, and we spent, I think, a morning doing active listening. I think that was actually the first time I actually even heard of the concept or the term active listening. But somebody would say something and then the listener had to summarize it back in their own words, within a minute or two. And it revealed, just how poor we are at listening, because you can't echo back what somebody said, and they'll say, yes, you have exactly summarized what I said to you. It's uncommon to get a successful round of active listening. Maybe someday we should do a workshop on active listening.
I also feel there is some jargon here within our group that you have to understand before you do fully understand. Like, I'll say some things sometimes, and I've heard Doug say, well, I don't know what you said. And then Sam will say, well, I understood what he said. And that feels good because Sam is thinking from a similar framework. So how do we make that more visual so that we don't even have to, be on our back heels in the first place? And that's kind of the idea with the sliders, Barry, right?
I'll make an observation though about that, because both Sam and Doug have their idiosyncratic vocabulary, words that they use a lot. And I've wondered where Colin picks up his vocabulary terms from. And over the year and a half that I've been attending, I noticed that Colin will repeat or use a lot more of Sam's vocabulary terms than Doug's, which sort of suggests why Sam knows what Colin's talking about, because Colin is basically repeating back verbal signals that he acquired over time from Sam.
Well, from my experience, I have to do more to align with Doug than Sam. Sam, I kind of get, I would put a few of his sliders more differently than mine. Definitely. It'd be interesting to talk about what those sliders would be and where I would set them. And that would be my opinion of him. And then he could say, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know you had that opinion of me. So it'd be interesting to have that game where we all have a mixing board with 10 personality traits, and we rate each person and then pass it around, and then we can see what other people think of you. Very dangerous game.
Does Sam put in the text, telephone, paper, active listening? Tearing papers throwing me off. So what can you say more about that comment?
In some of these weekend workshops that maybe I've taken and maybe some of you have also taken, especially about communication, it starts from the child's telephone game, right? So, you say something, whisper something to somebody else and go around the room. Inevitably, at the end of the line, it's completely different. Well, there's another exercise where you get everybody to sit back to back and hand each of them a piece of paper. So there's pairs of people, and the first person describes exactly what they're doing with the piece of paper, folding it a certain way or tearing it a certain way or whatever, okay? And you ask each to take 6 turns. The first, player A says 6 things they do to their piece of paper, and player B is supposed to do exactly the same thing as player A is saying. And then they turn around after 6 turns. You almost never find the same piece of paper.
Got it.
And that's another exercise in just showing how difficult it is to communicate precisely.
Right.
All of which plays into this active listening role, which is, am I summarizing? Am I capturing? Am I correctly regurgitating / repeating, et cetera, et cetera. So all part of the spectrum of active listening. Over, Kayla.
I specifically remember a telephone game when I was a kid that somebody was whispering something into my ear, and I clarified that with them. Is that what you said? And they would get so frustrated. No, that's not what I said. But because they were pressed up against my ear and it was all crazy, I was like, and they were trying to tell me what they were saying and getting really frustrated. I see that with adults today, where it's like, is that what you said? And they're like, no, that's not what I said. Or that's not what I meant. Like, how do you get to a point where it's not so triggering because the person can't really understand what you're saying, but you don't want to offend them or upset them, but you really don't understand. Yeah, that's
back away from the disaster.
So
That's
coming from coming from the point of view of the person that gets angry at that, because I just had this experience the other day and I was the one that got angry. There's a difference of whether you think the person can't understand what you're saying, or if you feel like they are choosing not to repeatedly not hear what you're saying. And so, somebody said to me that I'm a person who's quick to anger. Now, I don't see myself as a person quick to anger at all. But in this case, I did. I was like, no, because I felt like they didn't want to understand what I was saying. I knew they were capable of it.
Getting back to Sam's example, I had a very similar example in a communication workshop where I was handed a piece of paper with a bunch of geometric shapes on it. And I was supposed to stand so they couldn't see me or the paper and just say, in the upper left, there's a circle. In the upper right, there's a square. And so they were supposed to, replicate it as I was describing it. And it turned out that one of the figures was a trapezoid. And I said, well, and then there's a trapezoid in the lower left. Turned out half of the people didn't know what a trapezoid was.
I was going to say.
And so here I thought I was being very precise, articulating exactly the correct name of the shape and exactly where to put it on the paper. And I was astonished at how poorly people understood the recitation.
And that also goes to the point that I was trying to make the other day that came up about starting smaller to make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah. So parallelogram, trapezoid, good luck if you, how many of your audience know what those figures look like?
But you just a little while ago, you gave an example of, you said something, but then you added a word in case somebody didn't understand. So you use the word idiosyncrasies or idiosyncratic, but then you added, and they use it, like you gave context to it.
I mean, Sam uses a lot of vocabulary that's idiosyncratic to systems thinking. And Doug has this thing that they call Douglish, or whatever they call Doug's idiosyncratic language. And I don't think anybody can replicate Douglish.
What it seems to me that Doug does is uses 3 different words to form a relationship that have meaning. That's what I notice. Like he'll say, does anybody else notice that? Where he'll use
He's taken a lot. Yeah, he's taken a logic course, definitely.
3 words in a row. And when you put them all together, they all complement each other.
He was a lawyer. He's trained as a lawyer. They can't help but get their sentences grammatically correct.
And it's very accurate. I mean, I like that. It's very accurate.
Well, he's not perfect, but he does have a cadence that I really felt, he could be a hypnotist, a cult leader. He's good.
I don't think too many of us in this group are susceptible to cult leaders.
Well, he's his own god. He's his own god, so he's almost there.
But Doug was also said, I think Sam mentioned this yesterday, 4 emotions: mad, sad, glad, and afraid. I go, excuse me, that's it? That's your whole model of all the 4 possible emotions?
Wow. I was just thinking about where I would put the sliders different for Sam than Doug. And I think my whole experience at GCC has had those 2 characters who I see as, hosts, right? And not that it's just interesting that people are different. Like Barry's his own character, right? And Stacey, we all are. So it's very interesting where and I'm reiterating again, Barry, I'm sorry, but it is a preoccupation. Like we're speaking of things that we're attributing. How could we put that on the mixing board? Like, are we missing an opportunity instead of thinking we're labeling people to find some way to get a feedback system where people can help collaborate with collective intelligence by their cultural or domain behavior. You behave in one domain, different way in another domain. Are you selling out or are you just aligning? You know, is there an ultimate way to speak? And that's, you know, jargon is one word. If you know the jargon, like how do you make it easier for people to know the jargon or dispel the jargon?
Now here's the
Maybe
jargon
not.
for you. Linear independent model where you have n parameters and they're linear and independent. And that's your slider. Your slider model is linear and independent. And I cringe at that because I know the world is nonlinear, that things are correlated, either positively or inversely, and that you can't move one slider and leave the other one alone. They're not independent.
What if we put it as an advisor and not in the role of the king, right? So if it is the actual control system and we're using that to predict future events, then that could be chaos. But if we're using it just as sort of a memory device, like, you know, your advisor, and if it's done transparently, then it's not meant to insult the other person. It's actually what you see in the other person. Like, we do give friendly criticisms because, well, people have different strengths and different weaknesses and superpowers, right? So as it was labeled early on in GCC, trying to do that. Anyway, you know what I'm saying, Bear? Just take these small
I
opportunities
know what
to
you're
revisit
saying, but
old
I don't
ideas.
believe it because linear systems, by mathematical definition, are never chaotic, and nonlinear systems are almost always chaotic. So I stopped listening when you asserted something that's mathematically untrue.
I think where you put it in the system as a critical role may be a good reason for you to call, you know, if this is playing a critical role in the system decision making. Yes, I would agree with you, because it's experimental. Like when you build experimental software, you know, you kind of introduce it gingerly, right? And with ways of diagnosing and pulling it back, not just releasing some GMO on the world and changing the genetics. That would be a bad idea. Or some mad doctor of theory of mind. I know what you're thinking. Don't you try to tell me. I have the tape and I can tell you're lying. Look at your microaggressions. You know, but that was the movie. You know, the one that just did a remake of Harrison Ford, a futuristic movie where they have robots and they can't tell the difference between the bots and the people and they have to interrogate them. Blade Runner, that's it. Yeah. So that's where, you know, they have that little eye that comes out and looks at the faces while they're being interviewed, stuff like that. And they can tell if this person, they ask them a series of 5 questions, not to spoil it, but the main character, he had his own, I forget the name of these robots, but Harrison Ford had to ask her over 100 questions before he could tell that it wasn't human. Anyway, that's interesting. World we're may be involved in, not yet, but when it comes to trying to analyze people, like I think maybe you guys know better than I do, but there's databases on everybody. As soon as you're born, your buying habits and all this stuff that the large investment companies draw from. That's, you know, that's something that I think we just ignore. And now that it's getting closer and closer to dictating, you know, which stall we go into on the human farm, it's getting more serious. I don't know if we're going to get to that point, but if you know that following without experimenting, trying to get this feed somebody's temperament that you're having a conversation with, I think it is a good idea, some of the things I'm talking about. And it would be, you know, kind of a dream for me to find the right words to interest Barry so that he's not thinking, or find a way that he could criticize me and convince me that I'm going the wrong way. Right. This is part of a conversation game. And, you know, that's kind of my shtick for being here. You know, how do we navigate conversations? So, You know, I might filter Barry out of most of my conversations, but as somebody to build a conversation game, I might be interested in working with them. Right. So, you know, there's different aspects. I can't expect to, you know, be going playing pool with Barry. We don't, you know, as friends, but as academics, I think Barry's got a lot of value to offer. So I'm not going to confuse those two elements. You know, and I've kind of like to grown to like Barry as well. As he says that his superior said at the Bell Labs, either you're just gonna have to get used to me. And it's true. And I think I'm the same way. So, you know, I do read your body language, Barry, today. So yeah, I don't want to belabor it, but I just felt Barry pushed back pretty hard on, and, you know, we fought about this and got very upset, you know, and I was shocked and surprised at his dismay. So he's got something here that he really does want to make sure doesn't get put into my software server that creates a theory of mind virus of some sort that causes wars. So I don't know if we could talk about that more, Barry, but I do notice your not belligerence, but your idea that we shouldn't be sharing what we think each person's thinking. I'd like to know what other people think about that, because isn't that what the hand signals are for? And 3 people want to speak, so I'm going to shut up.
So this is kind of a checkout, but leading into hopefully a topic that we can talk about. I'm going to stay on and listen, but I would like to know how to speak to somebody who has a lot of anger and doesn't understand it. Like, for instance, the kid's dad. He does not think he's an angry person, but holy crap, I don't know if it's my relationship with him in the past or my personal triggers, but I feel like the man, when I talk to him, it's like every time I talk to him, I've just escaped death. It's just like so draining. And it's not just him. That's just an example. There are people that I would love to talk to, I'd love to listen to, who've got a lot of anger. For me, anger is power over. And I don't know if that is it's a good term to say, but I always feel like I'm powered over when somebody is angry at me. So I'll stop with that. But
Wait,
I
just have a question for you before you go.
Sure.
What is it about these angry people that you want to hear what they have to say?
Well, there's a reason why they're angry. And I don't know if they want to be angry, or if they can't escape that, or if they just want somebody to listen. Maybe that's just a part of me trying to make it so they're not angry. But
Well,
I feel like when somebody's angry, maybe they just want somebody to listen.
I mean, I happen to think you're right, and I'm only asking, having been someone that was drawn to angry people because I did want to help them, and that is not a good place to be. So that's why I just caution, you know, it's you know, there's something very nice about wanting to help people get out of their anger, but self-preservation is equally as important. So I just wanted to know.
Well, just one little tidbit, but because I have to unfortunately deal with their dad.
Well, yeah.
I have to deal with that. I'm complete.
What did I want to say? Okay, I think I remember what I wanted to say. I wanted to bring up something that I thought was interesting a couple of weeks ago, where Barry and Sam got into a conversation about rules and chaos. But the reason the conversation came up is because I kept pushing for it because I did want to know more. And I'm just using that as an example of conversations that flow well because you have 2 willing participants with information to share, but you also have a third kind of neutral questioning mind. And those 3 things put together, I think, are really positive. And that also kind of reminds me of, Sam, I forgot the form that I had come across that was yours, where you had different stakeholders in a conversation. And I think that that's a really important thing to do too, to make sure that there are certain stakeholders in the room to sort of create boundaries, or, you know, boundaries for conversation, if that makes any sense. I don't know how well I'm articulating that, but.
Yeah, thanks. If I went into that, I think I'd be here for another couple of hours. But just as part of my checkout, and Taylor knows this is a bit humorous, but I'm offering my services to communicate anything to anybody with any context. So I'll give you my business card later.
You mean that's a thing? I could be making money here.
Yep. Like, you know, if you have somebody you want to deliver a certain message to in a certain manner with a certain context, I'm willing to do so for you. Anyway, it's past the top of the hour. I very much enjoyed this. I don't know if anything was blocked or unblocked, but glad you guys have an interest in continuing this. Glad to be of service. I'm going to go into listen mode now and possibly distracted mode. Okay.
I'll check out too, but I just want to say that as opposed to blocked or unblocked, I'd rather focus on connected, and I felt connected in this call. And I will go into listening mode as well.
I would like to show some food that that I bought. So it
Meatloaf.
looks like this. I don't know if it's in America, but it's always in my country, mostly at
sweet?
Christmas. That's
Is that
Christmas.
sweet?
It's
Oh, that's
bread.
sweet.
What's
Yeah,
bread?
it's bread, and it has something inside.
Olives?
Like fig, that looks like panettone with figs. Does it have like figs
Yeah,
in
it
it?
has. I think I don't know. I think it's almond inside. It's sort of almond.
Oh, okay. Looks
Yes.
good.
Yeah,
Looks
and
like
it
a
has-
Danish.
in the Netherlands, and you can buy it many times. So they make advertisements for it around Christmas mainly, but also in Easter. But for the appetite, so I took it. I bought it for. So it's €2 and it's 1 kilogram. So can eat lots of it. Just for fun to show.
I actually have a contribution to make about anger. I've known people who had enormous anger that was completely opaque as to where it was coming from. And I bought a book called Anger, the Misunderstood Emotion by Carol Tavris. But the bottom line was that the most common root of anger is feelings of injustice. And we live in a system, we live in a world that is flush with systemic injustice. And everybody experiences some variety of injustice in this world of systemic injustice. So one thing that comes to mind is, what specific injustice is at the root of that person's anger versus a different person's anger? So possibly identifying by name the specific injustice that's sort of eating away at somebody might be a way to unpack the anger. That was just one thought that came to mind.
I like what you're saying about that. I know exactly the injustice that's done to my ex, but when you're talking to someone who's so passionate, but you don't know where their anger is coming from,
Yeah.
How do you bring that out of them?
Yeah, it's tricky because they may not be able to articulate it. I mean, there are so many failed marriages and divorces, and marital court and divorce court is thick with injustice. Both sides typically feels they were given a raw deal. So my first, wild guess would be, a difficult divorce and feelings of injustice as to how things were settled. And if it's not that, then you will have to do a lot more research to identify possibly, who has influence over the children. That could be another form of. So there's lots of things that one can hypothesize, but you wouldn't really know until you work through a long list and surface the one that is the systemic injustice, the persistent injustice that's not addressed. I know. I mean, I could tell stories of my own injustice that I became depressed over for a long period of time because, being angry didn't work, but being depressed was sort of the alternative to having anger about it. Go ahead, Stacy. I saw you.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I agree with what you said about the root of anger being that perceived injustice. I just want to point out that word perceived,
Right.
because often there's like this victim mentality where the person feels like there's been an injustice towards them, and that's not necessarily the case.
It may be equally balanced, but if it's 50-50, the person may not say, oh, I agree that this was 50-50. No, it was like 60-40 or 70-30. They'll perceive it lopsided.
Yeah. I mean, I'm like, I don't know if what I'm saying is accurate because I haven't really thought about it. So I'm playing in my mind. But my first response is that I usually find that people who are angry over a perceived injustice tend to be people that are less secure in themselves.
Yes. Yeah. So anxiety might be one clue. So the very first emotion axis I thought of was the anxiety confidence axis. And in my world, anxiety comes from not knowing what's going to happen or having control over it. And research and gaining knowledge and proficiency gives you confidence to handle something. So, for me to deal with somebody who has a lot of anxiety, if I can educate them, I can resolve it. But if they're uneducable for whatever inexplicable reason, then they will end up feeling this is unfair. You know what you're doing and I don't. And that's the injustice.
Yeah, and since you brought that up, it was something I was thinking about, that for me, when dealing with somebody along that scale, what's really important is the intensity at which they're feeling it.
Yes.
If the intensity is too high, there's really no room.
Yeah, it becomes bewildering or overwhelming. I found myself bewildered by the anger, and I had no idea where it was coming from. I eventually worked out a hypothesis, but I was never able to absolutely confirm it. But it took a couple of years to figure out where's this anger coming from. And in a word, it went back to a learning disability, which went back to a reading disability, which went back to dyslexia, which was genetically inherited. And that was the most likely hypothesis, but I still couldn't prove it.
Sam?
Just two thoughts coming back out of the woodwork. Okay.
We all did.
I don't have quite so negative a view, at least not in a default way, on anger. Because I always like what Lincoln said. You can tell the measure of a person by what makes them angry. So I think there's a role that anger can play in motivating one to react towards injustice. And I actually think that's quite valid. And I forgot the second thing I was about to say. Hey, Maxwell.
Sam, that's where I think intensity plays a role too. Because, if you're so angry, you can't even think straight.
Sometimes anger does help people think straighter also. Instead of getting out of this, analysis paralysis, anger can say, okay, I got to do this. Boom, I got to go focus.
That's anger with
yourself. There's a role for anger to play.
Yeah, that's anger with yourself even. Yeah. Because I was thinking more like you don't want to, if you have something important to say and you're saying it to a lot of people, you're probably going to offend a few people if they have a different worldview, if entity or their sense of justice, like Barry was saying, is compromised in some way, if they're holding on. So and if you got angry, then you might actually increase that So I always say, don't try to, try to do it unnecessarily, insult people unnecessarily. Like if they're going to be insulted, I'm sorry you're insulted, but I don't think that God square fits in my circle life right now. Please take it somewhere else. If when they knock on the door, how do you say to somebody, I need less of this, when they think that's what's better? So sometimes the conflict is just in that. And I think that's where I find things interesting to filter out at the get-go and instead of trying to accommodate something that's not going to fit unless certain agreements are made. Right. So how do you know what agreements to make up front so that people aren't, abused? Time-wise, if nothing else. Thank you.
Sam?
There's another thing that I'd like to express about anger, which is if anger is bad, and I say to myself, oh, I should not express my anger, and I sort of push it down, okay, then that leaves something unexpressed also, whether it's the exact source of the injustice or whether it's, something else. So it's, I think, like all other emotions, emotions are a way to stimulate you towards some constructive action. And the sooner I can actually process, move through that emotion and get to a constructive course of action, that is to me kind of a way I would channel the energy of that emotion into affecting my life in some way. So whether it's going out and, doing surveys on a particular issue, or, pounding the streets, knocking on doors for elections, or whether it's, building something that I care about, if I can channel that anger or channel that emotion towards a constructive course of action, that's where I think it's very useful. Sitting in the anger, I believe, is unhealthy for very long periods.
Yes.
But channeling it is a skill. Over.
Also disappointment in between, right? With the tuna roll or the crab roll, right? You're sitting there, you're not angry. Be angry. It costs a lot, but no, let's get him, they've given me lots of good ones before. So there's this element. So I think anger and comedy can both have like their 14 when you laugh out loud or you scream out loud. And then there's this tail, this, exponential back to calm. So, you have, but those two things, it's hard to fake anger and it's hard to fake laughter. Those are two, involuntary type almost actions, where the anger is a little bit more finessable with experience. It's hard to hold back the laughter as well. Like suppressed laughter is also very hard to do. You're in some place where you shouldn't laugh and you get the giggles. So anyway, yeah, this is very interesting how one can put the space in between the event and the action. And I think humor and anger are two where it's very hard to, especially when it's important. Like the crab roll wasn't so important, but maybe if it was, $1 million worth of crab rolls being shipped to a bar mitzvah or something, that might be different.
Crab rolls at a bar mitzvah.
Not kosher.
I know
Crab
everything
isn't
tasty.
kosher.
Kayla, is your hand up from before, or did you?
Don't complain. Eat the crab. Don't complain.
Kayla?
I was going to say, I agree with Sam in the sense that anger is a good motivator to do action. Because sometimes, especially when somebody isn't an angry person and they go out to speak and another person says, well, you shouldn't really talk about that. It's not the place. Well, yeah, it is. Sometimes it is the place. It is the place to see this emotional reaction that kind of inspires and motivates you to do something. And I do like what you said, Colin, about anger and laughter. It made me think about the times where I was really pissed off at something, but I knew it was inappropriate to express it to that person directly because it would hurt their feelings. But I called my sister and she was laughing at my anger. And that's something that's a treasure as well, because you are allowed to get angry at something, but to not let it consume you. And to be able to say to a friend, like, oh my God, that person just pissed me off. They're so stupid. And that
Yes.
friend laughs I think that's it. It's kind of lets you unpack anyhow.
After the
I'm
fact,
pleased.
yeah, after the fact, you can either laugh or cry, right? That's the saying. You can, I use that saying quite often. You can either laugh or cry. So
Yeah, so
humor is a healer.
I was also going to point out that anger is not a bad thing. Anger is a feeling. But I wanted to say, for the first time very recently, I heard somebody distinguish between feelings and emotions. And I really never understood that difference. And basically so the feeling is the signal. So you feel that angry signal. But what they were saying is emotions is when you stay stuck in that. So I think that was a good way to distinguish. Like when Sam was saying, it's unhealthy to stay in the emotion of anger, but it's healthy to take the signal or the feeling of anger as a call to action.
There's a Zen remark that anger is like taking a poison and hoping the other person will die.
Yeah.
But a friend of mine on Facebook, some of you may know her.
I like that. I like that.
Just went through a breakup after 15 years, and she's been processing it. And just the other day, she asked people to nominate their favorite piece of music on
Their
the theme of
breakup song.
breakups. And boy, there's a long list of people nominating their favorite music video processing breakups.
Did you happen to notice my comments there?
Yeah, I don't remember specifically which one, but I did notice you added a comment. Oh yeah, it was the one, beautiful imagery of one of the,
That's what Anne Marie said. The first song I put up was a really like a sad song, and it's sort of like begging somebody to notice before it's too late.
okay, maybe I missed it. I think I must be misremembering which is yours.
No, you saw it because her comment was about the video, what beautiful imagery it was. And then I made some comment about my flair for the dramatic.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I remember that now. But I don't remember the actual song because you didn't see the performer, you just saw these images.
Oh, it's a song called Say Something. It's Say Something, I'm Giving Up on You.
Oh, right. Yeah. Now it comes back. But it really was a long list of breakup songs.
Well, so the next comment I put was a totally different song. And I wrote, when I'm over the grief, I use this song because I do use music to process. Yeah. So the second song I put in was The Shadow of Your Smile, which is looking back at something fondly and remembering the good things and moving on. And
tossing out the garbage, yeah. So yeah, channeling anger into the arts, so satire, parody, comedy, those are my first go-to song parodies. Poetry, I'm not such a poet, but a lot of people will go to poetry or the theater, opera and theater and sitcom, whatever, so channel it into the arts. That's probably a lot. I think a lot of the arts, music composition, whatnot, is fueled by anger. Not all of it, but I think a lot of it is. It's a very healthy way to process the energy of anger. And even make money off it if you're a good artist.
I don't know what Banksy means, Sam. Banksy?
He's the artist who does graffiti. Do you know the graffiti artist of Banksy? Are you recognizing that name?
No, okay. It makes sense now. Graffiti.
You need to see some examples of it. He has a very idiosyncratic style of graffiti art, public art. And he signs it, but nobody supposedly knows who he really is. Publicly, they don't.
He's actually quite well known. And it's right, he has remained anonymous. And yet his works are so on point. Right. Really remarkable.
Okay, I'm going back in the background. I have to eat or I'm going to faint.
might do a future session on anger and, sort of a deep dive into anger and processing anger. I think it's a very worthwhile topic. I mean, people go to anger management workshops.
I have a friend who's got anger management. She has said so. She's actually a very intelligent woman, and I've wanted to invite her to these meetings because she has a lot of really interesting things to say. But because she's so quick to anger, like, well, maybe it's not a good idea that you're coming to these meetings, because I think she'd probably get rather irritated by some of the small things that wouldn't really bother a normal person so much.
But it's grist for the mill, and people will take these little episodes of anger and work them into dialogue scripts in sitcoms or dramas.
So do you think that war is in relation to anger?
Yes. Unjust enrichment. I mean, if you look at almost any act of war, it's trying to balance the books or gain an upper hand or unjust enrichment. And then the other side will fight against it.
So it's a balance of powers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you think it's necessary?
Well, I think it's necessary to achieve balance, but using violence, I think, is probably one of the stupidest practices our species ever adopted. Using violence to rectify a situation, because it basically compounds it. It's answering one injustice with an equal and opposite injustice, which only doubles the total amount of injustice in the system. An eye for an eye, and pretty soon the whole world is blind. Gandhi is given credit for that quote.
So maybe I'll share another vignette. I used to hold conferences for Doug Engelbart. And either in 2008 or 2010, because we're amateur conference conveners, I and my colleagues, we did things the best we could. We set up a venue, we set up, speakers, we did the schedule, we did, whole meeting areas, we did food. And then there was this one fellow came to me at intermission and said, "You guys haven't taken care of this, you haven't taken care of this, you haven't taken care of this, why haven't you, done all of these things?" And I just stood there, I didn't know this person at all. And I just said, "Why are you so angry at me? Why did you, think that I was a person you could take this out on, and why is it so important?" The person walked away. But the real point of the story is 2 years later, when we did the conference again, he came up to me again and said, nobody had ever asked me that question before, why I was so angry. And then he realized, yeah, he had no reason to be angry at me. And then he went into further introspection, and then he actually did manage to identify the source of his anger.
Interesting.
But I just was surprised, and I found it almost impossible to really take on that anger because I didn't know, what the guy was even talking about. But I did think it was fascinating that he did come up to me afterwards and thanked me for asking him that question.
Yeah.
It's an unusual experience.
I've had something similar when I was working at MITRE, which is a defense contractor. I had one confidant that I would disclose my anger to him. And he would say, "Are you angry at me?" And of course I wasn't. I was just, relaying things I was angry about, but he was not the cause. But he had to say, "Are you angry at me?" I said, "No, I'm angry, but not at you."
There's a scene in Taxi, the movie, that reminds me of. Remember that one?
You know, if you saw the movie.
You talking to me? You speaking to me? Remember that movie?
I know that line.
That was a TV series?
No. Very famous movie. In fact, name the actor. Very famous actor.
Robert De Niro.
Exactly. Exactly. Are you talking to me?
Where are you coming from? That's the
Well,
other.
I have video evidence on Zoom calls of at least 3 times where I've had to stop people and say, why are you yelling at me?
Yeah. And then the answer is, or the response is, I can't hear you when you yell at me. Have you ever heard that? And that's actually true. One of my coworkers at MITRE was a young mother, and she would yell at her children. And I suggested to her that she asked the children to recite back the content of the message delivered in anger. And because I said, my understanding is that when somebody feels like they're under attack, the language center shuts down and they go into defensive posture, but they're not parsing the words. And she said, you're right. They would have no idea what words I had used to articulate the anger. Which sort of shows that it's sort of a useless exercise. It may make you feel good, but it only makes the situation worse.
You know, I aspire to be like that person, Sam. The one that apologized to you later, didn't realize that they were angry. If only the rest of the world was self-aware and can go back and be okay with being wrong.
People will express being disgruntled a lot. Have you ever heard anybody express being gruntled?
Being gruntled?
Yeah, we're all disgruntled.
Disgruntled?
We'll talk about being disgruntled. When have you ever heard anybody say, I'm gruntled?
That's true.
So we're much more likely to express anger than satisfaction or being at peace.
By the way, I told Maxwell that you don't think he has ADD and that he has BSS. Was it BSS?
Yeah. Boredom surfeit syndrome.
Yeah.
What did he say?
He goes, that's right. Boredom syndrome.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So when I work with somebody as an educator, but I don't want to have my teaching agenda, I'll say, tell me what you're curious or fascinated or confused or surprised about. What is it that, that intrigues you? And if I can get them to reveal something that they're interested in learning, I say, great, let's learn that. The theory is that every day, everybody's ready to learn something. What are you ready to learn today? Let's learn that. What a pretty wrapping. Big
I
white
love.
book. You're wrapping
I can get.
presents. The day after Christmas, you're wrapping presents.
This is for my son's girlfriend. He wants me to wrap it because I love wrapping and I like making it nice. I have bows and I have actual, I make it into bougie presents. Well, I'm going to clean, so I'm going to put my camera off. But I'll be listening if everybody still wants to talk.
I think I'm all talked out.
Yeah, I think I'll probably check out, but there's some interesting ideas spoken of. Oh, here's some treats. So yeah, have a good festive times and Merry New Year. If I don't see you before then.
Or next time. I put something in the barn raising thread. I was trying to send it and it wasn't sending the way I wanted. But the comment I made was that I would love to see a conversation between scientists and sound healers that looked to create a model that would explain why things may be the way they're asserted to be. So to be clear, what I put in was somebody talking about the power of sound and the power of signals to, again, I won't even go into what it was, but whereas typically I'm used to somebody else coming in and saying, well, there's no scientific reason for that. I would welcome a conversation where people with knowledge of both could come together and perhaps form a model that fits and that explains why that works. That's what I really, really want to say. And Barry, I wanted you to see that in particular.
Yeah, I think there's empirical evidence. Music hath charms and soothing sounds, nature sounds, and all do calm people down. There's certainly evidence, but I don't know if there's any theory.
But this
express
goes
theory to say
beyond
why
that.
that is true.
But what she's saying really goes beyond that, because she even mentions like the Reiki symbols, which again goes into energy healing, not considered by certain people to be science. It's considered woo. And unfortunately, there's information that gets left out of the conversation because these two groups of people aren't speaking together.
Yeah.
And so that's,
Given that harsh sounds can be grating to the ear, and that's pretty obvious, you know, harsh sounds are grating, that soothing sounds can be soothing.
but again, I really believe there is way more of a depth of knowledge there than just harsh sounds or soothing sounds.
Not to crack that open, but that was in, I stuck around to hear that through. I think again, the alignment word, if you're aligning on the crystals themselves, then there might be difficult between the scientist and the Reiki person. But if you're focusing on the person and what's better, then you could work together, I suppose. I don't
But
know.
I'm not-
If it's
not
about
saying-
the crystals, it's not going to be very easy to do.
What I'm suggesting is that a conversation between the two with some questions from a neutral party that's just asking simple, basic questions, so that instead of pitting two schools of thought against each other, questions that are designed to find the common answers that both parties would give. It's,
Why
you
do
know,
lullabies?
I just want to
Yeah,
say
I
there's
get
two
it.
different ways to approach something. There's a way to approach something as, well, if he's right, that means I'm wrong. That's one way that people sometimes approach something. And another way is, how are we both right here? Because if I respect somebody else, I have to assume that there's some sort of valid viewpoint there, like it came from somewhere and it's not just nonsense.
Well, if it's anecdotal, then it's different than being something that's, if it's a story versus testability. And, it really is about the betterment. So if the attention that's given to them by the service of the role playing with crystals and telling of stories and going through ritual, and I think there's a whole mirroring of emotions that's going on there, whether you're using crystals that are made of this or glass or imaginary crystals even, right?
Well,
That's what I'm saying.
Barry put in the chat, why do lullabies work? And I think my point is we could probably come up with 5 different reasons that lullabies work. And instead of just picking one and saying, this is the reason, if we acknowledge, yes, this is the primary reason, and this adds to it, and this could add to it, and this
Right.
could be part of it. Like, do lullabies work differently if they're sung by a stranger? Do they work differently at different volumes? Do they work differently, with the different visual setting? I mean, there's so many other variables that get left out when you're speaking to a homogeneous group.
But my friend Nancy had a
Go ahead.
CD with a mixtape on it, and she would stream it back when streaming was a brand new thing. And so I would listen to her have this thing on repeat. And there was one song in it that was a lullaby, and it was in Gaelic, and it was sung by a folk singer in Nova Scotia. So there's a Scottish ancestry. And it was I really loved the music. It was very soothing, beautiful, and intriguing, but it was in Gaelic. So I looked it up, and I found the translation from the Gaelic to English. And the actual words of the song is, she's singing to the baby, you're going to grow up to be a criminal just like your father. So that's really hilarious because the lyrics, are sort of denigrating both the baby and the father, and yet the music is very, lilting and low. And it's, you have to ask yourself, what's going to happen when this baby learns Gaelic at age 7 or 8 and
Well,
finds
to
out
me-
what words mean.
But to me, that's even further evidence of the power of the actual sound.
Exactly. That's the point. The words mean nothing. A lot of popular music, you would really have to go look up the lyrics, because you can't quite make out the lyrics just from listening to it. And lyrics turn out to be, quite alarming relative to what you think the song is about.
And if I could just add that happens in conversations all the time, where people will say, but I said this, this, and this, but it was the way you said it.
Right. Yeah. I tried that. I went up to my neighbor's dog and I put my hand on it. I said, well, you're just the ugliest thing I've ever seen. And it wags its tail. But you can sort of prove that, the actual words don't mean anything. It's the whole nonverbal part of it that carries the message.
That's what really drives me to learn more about energy.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I didn't want to stop Barry. He's on a roll there, but with the discussion you were saying about having the molding of the models, and specifically around Reiki, or crystals, you could say.
Well, I never brought
have-
up crystals and I purposely didn't use that example of crystals.
Well, I think it's a
I-
good one because it's on
don't
the
think
difficult
it's a good one.
side.
Yeah.
It's on the difficult side to accommodate is what I'm saying. So you'd have to really work hard to bring it in. But I do think that there's a lot of benefits that are actually worth identifying. And because the crystals are so questionable as a reliable source of therapy, the other things that are happening probably are. And that's more of a scientific way to approach that.
See, I
But
disagree.
also, yeah, but you don't have to presuppose that. I can tell you what my bias is, and we could try to filter that out.
No, but I disagree that that's the scientific way. I think there's too many variables built into the crystal. I purposely used the idea of Reiki and symbols because it's theoretical. It's about thought. And I wanted a theoretical model for how
Yeah.
something might work.
Ah, I see.
There's
I see.
an interesting kind of a Trojan horse phenomenon. I was visiting a friend of mine up in Maine, and he scheduled a therapy session for both of us, a massage session with a woman down the street from where he lived. And the woman did a standard massage, but then she did the thing where she'd lay the crystals out on you and do some kind of incantation, which I wasn't expecting. But I thought, what's the role of the crystals? And I thought, aha, it's a trick, because what people really want is attention. And it's an excuse to spend time paying attention to somebody without actually communicating anything. The crystals is just a trick so that this person could spend another 10 minutes of focused attention on caring about the well-being. And that was the message, that I want you to get better. The crystals were just a hack.
Well, you don't know that. That's your assumption.
That was how I perceived the use of the crystals. It's like she didn't believe in them either. It was just another way to prolong the session without doing the hard work of massage. She could just lay the crystals out and then do this little lullaby incantation, and it was another way to extend the session for another 10 minutes. And I actually had, I don't know if it might have been this very same session. I think she, either that session or a different one, she prayed for me. And another one, it was another kind of unexpected thing. And it just meant that, yeah, this person really wants me to end up healed. And knowing that they want you to end up healed, the actual way that you frame the message was less relevant than the fact that, she really wants you to get better.
Yeah. Sincerity counts where.
Yeah. The sincerity of the message is more important than the actual way it's framed.
I agree. Yeah. You have to sometimes see beyond that. And scientifically, you could measure for that a bit, for sincerity and tone of voice
Right.
and length of session. And, if they did the crystals for 5 minutes or they did it for different 5-minute intervals, like you could see there's a certain payoff point, like at 15 minutes, the person really seemed to feel better. But after that, it was just, the investment really didn't pay off.
It was just a
So, you could,
multifaceted approach. It wasn't, she did singing, she did chanting, she did praying, she did massage, she did a whole bunch of different things, and it was all part of a package. It's like, you go to the opera and there's one song you love and the rest of them, okay.
well, this really counts to what I wrote in the chat, which is about you're getting into the music. And I think, music is a spiritual thing, right? It's a spiritual language in a way. And this lullaby plays into the lullabies. Really, the words were kind of not as relevant as the cooing sounds, right?
Exactly.
Could
Words
have
meant nothing.
spoken it in any language, could have been any language at all, really. So, or just hummed, for instance, which is sometimes more soothing, right? So, but I think you can look for the pattern in spiritual services, you could say, where they have their traditions and people expect that, and then they have their pipe organs, and it has this real spiritual effect that if you took away all the pageantry, you may still have the faith, but it's not the same thing as after the cathedral has fallen than when you were in this big grand cathedral. I think it's a different mood.
People go to football games and they love to cheer. It's just getting the energy out in the
That's
cheering is part of the whole experience. You could sit there and just watch the game, without becoming emotionally engaged, but people want to become emotionally engaged and cheer for their side and berate the other team. And, it's just processing your emotions physically.
But what about
See you later,
what
Denise.
about if it's more than that? What about if it's more than that? What about if it has to do with tuning into the same frequency as somebody else?
Yep.
And this
frequency
is the
or
frustration I
mom?
have. No, frequency. The frustration that I'm having, especially when we talk about music, and the reason that I wanted to start with just the science and just the theoretical model of if something worked, like starting with the imagination, if this were the case, then how would this tie into what we already know about science? Because, so like Barry, you're assuming that the crystals were, a ploy or whatever. And I didn't want to start with crystals because I think it's way too complicated. But let's start with Reiki.
Placebo. Placebo's the word, I think.
It was the excuse to pay attention to somebody without having to do a lot of work.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe is my point. But I've seen people go through a Reiki experience where the Reiki practitioner, they envision certain signs and symbols in order to facilitate energy going through them. And I've seen people, my ex-husband, who is not an emotional person, be brought to tears. And there is no way to explain that. And I've heard from other people have said the same thing, and I know my experience as well. So to say that it's just a placebo or it's just having attention being paid, I think that we might be missing parts of that story. And the only way you get all those parts is when you have equally intelligent people adding bits of knowledge and possibility to the story so that we could expand the story and not stop with, well, this is why it works. It works because the baby hears its mother. Okay, that might be part of it. Maybe there's more. There's not enough experimentation before we jump to the, the next hypothesis. Or I don't know, maybe I'm not wording it right, but it's
so here's a challenge for you. A lot of people love Christmas music because it just puts them in a good, cheerful mood. Yesterday, I got into, was very excited. I was applauding at great length. I was jumping up and down for joy. I was having this wonderful feeling. What was the event?
Could have been anything from singing happy birthday to somebody to a foot, it could have been anything. I don't know.
It was watching the successful launch of the James Webb Space Telescope. I was streaming it at 7 o'clock in the morning, and they were narrating, the progress of the launch and the insertion into orbit, and every point where they finally got it. And my emotions just flooded when it was a success.
And I might ask you, how many other people do you think at the very same time were tuned into that same energy and feeling that exhilaration?
People
And
just
that's
like
what I'm
me.
Yeah,
But
I would think
I
over
tried.
the whole day that happened, because I did it later when I watched it.
my point is that we say we're all connected, but then we sometimes forget to think about how those connections may be operating when they're not right in front of our face.
And I was thinking, why aren't people like that running the world? Here, people know what they're doing. They're competent. They're conscientious. They're engaged, and they really enjoy the experience of success after 20 years of planning and hard work.
They
And
are
it
running
pays
the world,
off
Barry.
when the bloody thing successfully enters into orbit and is running.
They are
what a
running the world.
wonderful
They just
feeling.
don't know it. They're unsung heroes, what they are.
Well, I sang them.
Yeah,
I'm
I know, but
applauding.
we're geeks. We're geeks. But
Yeah.
Stacy has a point, not to steamroll her point about how all aspects need to be considered before they're dismissed. And I think that's an expensive process that you would have to consult somebody through. And the first few times, I think it would be a teaching exercise back and forth, right? And a learning exercise and a teaching exercise both ways. And then you'll get a shorthand that when it comes to Reiki, like Stacy was saying, it is I want to use it as a model, but I don't want to use it as the subject of our discussion. Something like Reiki has a procedure, and then we can look at Reiki and say, well, scientifically, this and that, different outcomes. What would we measure? What would be a way to have a controlled experiment so our biases aren't taking over, right? And yeah, so I don't know if that's what you mean, Stacy, but I know Barry's the kind of person that enjoys the puzzles of analyzing. So
What I'm saying is that, let's say that imaginary conversation happened in my mind. So I have this woman that I would want to be at the call. I would want Barry to be there. Maybe somebody else that I haven't really identified yet, somebody with a real science kind of background. I could imagine the woman saying something about a signal, and then Barry saying, oh, yes. And did you know that the Greeks also used that sign? Like, I could imagine connections being made that wouldn't otherwise be made if we didn't have those two schools of thought coming together.
Omens and signals. And some omens merely bring to mind something else, even though the connection is all strictly imaginary, still it's a connection. Bring something to mind. Remember yesterday when I said, what's the difference between a child and a scientist? And you said imagination. You said imagination. But in fact, scientists and children, they both rely on imagination. And you imagine something and you check to see if that hypothesis has any merit. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't.
And didn't Einstein say something about
imagination is more important than knowledge? I think he said something to that effect. Because theory construction begins with imagination.
Yeah.
Look at the imagination that went into the James Webb Space Telescope. The engineering solutions are just astonishing, given the challenges that they had to face.
What was the riddle that Einstein had about if he had to solve a problem and he had 1 minute to solve it? How much time would he spend
55 minutes finding the right question to ask. And then 5 minutes answering the question that took him 55 minutes to come up with. What's the right question to ask?
And that
I
takes
found that
the
in
resilience
research.
and that takes the resilience of anxiety, knowing how to, be able to hold back from thinking everything's a nail. You know what I'm saying?
But when I was at Bell Labs,
Stacy's saying.
When I was at Bell Labs and I would go talk to one of my office mate, not the office mate, but the guy in the next office who's working on a problem, I would listen to him describe the unsolved problem for which he has no idea how to solve it. And after a while, I would see, can I ask exactly the right question that makes the breakthrough happen? And that was the goal. You know, what is the unasked question, which if I can formulate that question, makes the thing get unstuck. And essentially that's really goes back to Socrates, maybe even before Socrates, but that was always the challenge. What's the right question to ask? That
And it's
focuses
almost-
their attention on the thing that they have to focus their attention on to make progress.
But it's almost impossible to find the right question to ask if you think you already know all the answers.
Exactly.
And that's the key.
And that's why
And-
I would go in when it was pretty obvious that nobody knew the answer, let alone me. I wasn't
Yeah,
even
wicked
assigned the
problems,
problem.
Yeah,
But, you
wicked
know, what-
problems are that way by default, right?
Well, I don't know what the definition of a wicked problem, but.
Well,
okay.
you just can't characterize them and you can't test them ahead of time. You don't, they're one shots.
You can't look up the answer in the back of the book, maybe is what you mean.
There's no, yeah. There's social problems. Like, what do you do about the economy? What do you do about this? Right? All
By
those
the
kinds
way,
of things.
though,
Governance.
Part of the reason I'm so focused on the power dynamics is that I want it to be easier for people to ask questions, because especially at an early
Yeah.
age, many people that might have very good thought-provoking questions are made to feel foolish about their questions. Now, if you're somebody in power, you don't worry about that because nobody would dare make you feel the consequences of what it feels like to be foolish, because they're
I
going
think
to
that-
kiss your butt. They're going to tell you you're a genius. They're never going to tell you that you're wrong. But if you want to empower average people, it has to become the norm to be able to think as if you don't know the answer.
Trump would blow off journalists and say, you're a very bad journalist, instead of answering the question that the journalist asked.
You have no idea how much I would have loved my moment early on to be able to interview Trump. I really, really would have. At this point, it's probably too late. But early on,
Yeah.
that was
Dream
my
on,
dream.
girl.
That was
Dream
my
on,
dream.
girl. Wow.
That's
Only
yeah,
in front of people.
he would
He
blow you off. Instead of taking a question seriously.
You're
he'd
already worried
bullshit
about
you
him.
or blow you off.
Oh, you got to stay away from Trump, Stacey. He's already traumatized. Know it.
Oh, he hasn't traumatized me at
I'm
all.
just kidding. I'm just kidding. Yeah, he's an awful man.
I actually feel sorry for him, but
Well, the question that I have on my mind, and I don't know how to answer it, is he truly self-deluded and believes that the falsehoods that he utters, or does he know that they're falsehoods, and does he knowing that he's lying?
I think that answer has changed over time. I think he used to know. At this point, I'm not sure that he knows the difference. I'm really not. I think he's almost bought into his own delusion.
Well, this is
Which
it.
is easy
Does
to
he have
do
faith
when
in
you have
faith? Yeah.
people, when you have people making you think that the way you're thinking is correct,
That's
and you
right.
believe that.
That's right. Religion is an example of that too.
And you
Sort
haven't
of.
tested your
Put that out.
hypothesis. You've adopted a hypothesis, asserted it as if it's the ground truth, and nobody dares question you. You know that line from, I think, Carl Sagan.
That's what I was going to mention.
You know,
But
I'd
what
rather
Stacey was
no,
saying.
it's fine, man. I'd rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. I think it was Feynman who said that.
But, you know,
Okay.
there were a few times where it's very clear that Trump knows he's lying. Like when he says something like, just do this and we'll take care of the rest.
Well,
He
that's-
knows that he's going to be covering up something, or that's an indication that he knows he's lying. So
Well, that's business.
doesn't
That's
know.
business. Results. All that matters is results. Let's get the results and then fill the cracks in afterwards. It's a lot of that. Like, I can't work in that world. I would not be a good president because I would become perplexed in the options. Probably. I would regret so much making the wrong decision. I don't know. Maybe I get used to it. I think that's a skill, right? But as you know, I'm detailed, analyzed. So I'm sort of like, waiting 55 minutes to find the right question, and in 5 minutes. And if everybody's screaming at me at 40 minutes in, it's kind of hard to think about the right question. So having the right people in working with you in your lab is important. People that know what's going on. So if you're just talking about random people getting together
Yeah.
or something that isn't going to be followed through on, I think a lot of these things that once you've played the game of discernment and you have your terms and things agreed upon, then you're going to have an iterative game. So if you're following something with somebody or just starting something, it's a different thing. And how many times, I think you have to not have such high expectations with just trying to align with somebody on the first meeting, unless they are really, you find sometimes, like I think Barry mentioned it today, people that you have something in common with. Maybe it was earlier.
Finding
last
common
week.
ground. I mean, this is where I think if Sam would sit down with maybe a relative stranger in some kind of a setting, and I would think for Sam, it's, can we find some common ground with the expectation that maybe we could collaborate and make some progress on this common ground that we're both interested in. And so, you meet somebody and say, what does this person have in common with me that they can contribute something that I'm missing, I can contribute something that they're missing, we can co-create something that neither of us could have done alone. That's progress on our common ground. To me, that's a win-win. That's what I would want to have as the outcome. But there are other people who say, well, I want to be in the entertainment business, and I want people who are having a really funny fight and don't have common ground, because then I can turn that into a comedic sketch or a drama and sell it to people who are going to sit there and laugh at it. That's not what because I'm not a dramatist, I'm not a sketch artist.
But you see, that's where the question for me is, so what is it that you really want to inspire? What are you looking to inspire? I mean, I love humor, but there are certain comedians that I turn away from because I feel that what they're actually doing is hurtful. And my main goal is not to hurt, it's to heal. Now, does that mean I'm going to turn away from all humor? No. But I mean, I have friends that are comedians that have been really damaging to people. And my feeling was they could have taken that same skill and helped to create positive effects using that humor.
Yeah, I mean, watching a good comedic sketch can result in the audience gaining insight. But if my goal is to gain insight, and it is, probably comedy would not be the first method that I would choose. I would try to gain insight through a more collegial, congenial engagement. And if that fails, if the collegial, congenial engagement doesn't yield insight, then I might turn to something else like satire or parody or some other essay or something else as a backup plan, but not as the first approach. And then, of course, I have somewhere insight simply has so many obstacles that I have not yet discovered a method of arriving at a shared insight. And those are the frustrating, those are perplexed. So if I say, well, I'm vexed and perplexed, it means that there's some insight that I want to get out there. The classical one is the one that Sam and I talked about last week that Stacy brought up, is that why are rule-based systems turning out to be chaotic when they're supposed to be yielding order? But think about it, a rule-based system defines a game, for example, and games are a conflict and are a contest. So rules define contests and games.
I do have another log for the fire of this kind of a campfire. The log is an example, a concrete example that might be able to see if we can reflect these ideas on of how people manage the COVID conversation and what different angles there are to it. And the fact that this is, there's woo-ness all around it and there's science all around it. It affects the whole world. It seems to be a study in these things we seek to have collective intelligence in. Like,
ask yourself how many people who are arguing over COVID could articulate the SIR model. I mean, I mentioned the SIR model, I think, to Teese yesterday, and he didn't recognize the name. I think he looked it up, but I don't think he recognized the name. And the classical systems theoretic model of an epidemic is captured in this mathematical model called SIR. People who are susceptible, they haven't caught the disease, but they're susceptible to catching it. Then there's the people who are infected. The second group is they not only were susceptible, they got the disease and are currently infected, meaning that they're also can pass it along to others. And then the third one is recovered. People who were susceptible, got infected, and then recovered and are no longer susceptible. So your population is basically divided into these three categories: susceptible, infected, recovered. And then you say over time, what fraction of the population is in each of these three categories? And you have its dynamic model. And that turns out to be a very good model for the life of a disease. And also, that's where you get flattening the curve. Flattening the curve is the outcome of using the SIR model and realizing that you want the thing to be over time so that the peak doesn't overwhelm and overload the hospital and the health system. You want the peak of the SIR model where the number of infected is maximized. You don't want that to be more than the capacity of the hospital and healthcare system. Because then you
what you just said is an analysis of a wicked problem, which you do have some constraints on, but mathematically you can tell it's an exponential thing, and you kind of know, but you don't know when it's going to be over, if people are going to get inoculated. And so there's a whole lot of variables with that type of a problem. But in this instance, mankind has got past the Reiki crystals. Like, we're not running around in the Black Plague wondering what's going on. So I think, but we still need to use skills. So I would see here, Stacy would be able to be like the front line with people being concerned that they're not freaking out in the administration. And Barry would be one of the heading up the science of the, the CDC or whatever. And so
you're working
Stacy would
alongside
be
Fauci, saying how can we get people to understand the SIR model so they understand why we're masking or social distancing or lockdown, because we don't have a vaccine and we don't have a treatment. And so we need to flatten the curve so we don't overwhelm the hospital.
Okay,
That's
so we know this.
That's an easy thing to understand if you get the SIR model. If you don't, you don't understand why these strategies make sense.
Do you want to say something, Stacy?
No, I was gonna, I agree with everything that's being said, but having had many of these conversations, part of the problem is, so let's say, Barry, they accept what you're saying is the model. Many of these people are still coming from the place of, I know my body, I'm not going to get it. So, and because they've been ridiculed from the beginning, when there are people, I know people that have cured themselves of cancerous, from cancerous cells and stuff like that, where their doctor said, no, you're crazy, but the proof is there. They did it. So again, rather than to ridicule them, I just try to jump ahead to the need for the mass, not so much for them, but for the rest of the population, because while they are not going to be moved as far as whether or not they think they need the vaccine, we might be able to get them to shift and realize that other people are vulnerable. And even if what they say is true and they don't need it, they're still carriers of this germ that can be very harmful for someone else.
Exactly. That's where the SIR model helps you quantify the likelihood that you'll pass it on to grandma or the child.
Right. But if you're right, but if we're already set up in a situation where we're just ridiculing each other, I've been ridiculed for wearing a mask. If we're so stuck in the ridicule part instead of the, well, I could see your point of view. Now let's move to the next step. How do we fix this? We're not going to get anywhere. And that's where we see ourselves.
Yeah. And it perplexes me that we have such a huge part of the lay population who are unscientific. They not only do they not know to do science, they don't appreciate science when it's done well by people who do know how to do science. the science appreciation, I think, is a bigger problem than not knowing the science. Because I can understand, okay, SIR model is a bit mathematical. Not everybody's going to be able to wrap their head around the model, but can they at least appreciate people who do?
Okay.
But it's more
how
than that.
about-
I just want to say one more thing, Colin, because this came up
Yeah, sure,
today.
sure.
We have a county executive that has refused to enforce the indoor mask mandate. Now, it's not that he doesn't believe the science. I don't think that's what it is. I know the person. I've had conversations with him. He's an intelligent person. It's purely politics.
Yeah.
So on this post, rather than talk about that, said, when is it okay for an official to not enforce a mandate? Who gets to pick and choose? I mean, he's basically not listening to his boss. And I want people to understand that this could happen in a different circumstance. So we're either going to say, yes, if there's a mandate in our state, we follow it, or no, we're not going to follow it. It can't be when it suits you.
Maybe he realizes that the chaos from the enforcement policy is worse than letting it slide, because sometimes the enforcement causes more harm than letting it slide, and that's a value judgment.
No,
I mean,
he's
look at the traffic stop, or a person gets a traffic stop for something minor, and it ends up somebody died because
No,
it escalated, it went chaotic.
In this case, he's looking to score political points because
Oh, okay.
early on, he had gotten in trouble in the very beginning when everybody was taking COVID very seriously for being photographed out at a restaurant, no mask, the whole bit. As soon as he got that backlash, he changed.
Yeah.
Now time has gone, now he's changed again. So it's really whatever's gonna suit his political agenda. And
That's
if
right.
we keep fighting in that same way, we're actually helping him and other
Well-
politicians like him. And I don't want to do that.
People learn in very peculiar ways. You can't, as an educator, I realize that some people learn by the method that I found worked for me. Other people learn by a method that wouldn't have worked for me. It would have been suffering to learn the hard way. The school of hard knocks. I wouldn't want to go to the school of hard knocks, but there are people who say, well, I went to the school of hard knocks and I learned, and I wouldn't have learned if I'd sat in the classroom. Probably true.
Yeah.
Okay, I have to
So-
go shower.
Okay,
I'm going.
I'm gonna,
It
all
was
right, so if
nice.
anybody has any last things to put in the chat before I save it and close, now's your
Well,
last
I know I
chance.
put it in there. I just thought that this thing that it's been 3 years or more, some of the ideas we've discussed on the GCC and tried to come to understandings. And I see it as a sandbox, and the public thinking about COVID is kind of like a parallel. Stacy said earlier on, but as time goes on, people are switching back and forth, and we should have some understanding, like what Barry was trying to emphasize that he would do if he was trying to help with the messaging.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think it is interesting that GCC is a bit of a sandbox where we're trying to get that understanding too with a variety of people.
So let's build a sandcastle together and let's not throw sand in each other's face.
Sounds like a deal. All right.
On
No
that note,
typhoons.
bye-bye.
See ya.